Godfather System. By Agoraphobic Dragon. Edward Hill was an old man, content with his lot in life as a godfather, preparing his retirement when an unexpected ambush ruined his plans. Stepping through a portal of light was dangerous and foolhardy, stealing the destiny of a young man was tasteless, but when the choice was between that and death, he was more willing to take that deal. Now, stranded in a new world, alone with no support, surrounded by people with treating him like a commodity, he must choose. Toe the line. Or, once again, create his own path. And then, there was this mysterious system, calling him a hero. What a ridiculous idea. I don't remember the last time I was in a library, but it must be at least a decade. Not beaches, I didn't like them. While I preferred the sharp smell of expensive scotch over dust, libraries had their own charms. Unfortunately, a man of my status could hardly walk in a public location without bodyguards, and I didn't want to unsettle the people who treated the place like a second home. Unfortunately, sometimes, we were forced to do things that we didn't want. Today, I didn't care about their general comfort as I dashed wildly, uncaring the sound of my desperate stomps. No stony-faced librarian met me with their fingers raised in warning, not even when I grabbed a shelf as I took a wild turn, deliberately pulling it down. No resident popped into my path to blame me for damaging the library. I didn't blame them. The sight of an old, bleeding man, desperately running was unsettling enough. Add in the gunshots and my suit is ruined, I murmured as I made a sharp turn. It was an expensive suit, impeccably tailored. A gift from Master Tailor Giotti. Michael would have nagged me to death about it, I murmured, trying to suppress the hint of melancholy that rose at the mention of him. Michael, my loyal bodyguard of 20 years, and a great friend. The man threw himself in the path of a bullet just to give me a chance to retreat. And, just like that, another friend was gone, the memory of him nagging me during breakfast, the last unbloodied memory remained. A very important meeting, he said. You needed to look like a proper godfather even if you're almost in your 60s and retired, he said. And now, he was gone, betrayed and ambushed. I ran, hoping to get away. I wanted to survive, so that I could make them who Edward Hill really was, and teach them what a great mistake they had committed forcing me out of my retirement. But for that, I first needed to get away from the 3 assassins who desperately chased me. 3 young men, all faster than me in their youth, armed with assault rifles. While I just had a little pistol. Oh, the irony, I murmured. The only reason they failed to catch up with me was their bulky weapons. It was much harder to run with an assault rifle, enough to give an old man like me momentary hope. I pulled another shelf, hoping to slow them enough that I could find a nook to hide, desperately pressing against my wound to stem the bleeding, glad that it was not an artery. It was a long shot, and I needed a miracle to get away, especially since I couldn't expect any police response soon. Whoever assassinated me no doubt spread some cash around the station, enough to make sure their job was not interrupted. If a miracle is what I need, that's what I'll get, I growled as I continued to run, pushing my old bones to the limit. I wasn't going to surrender even if I had only a sliver of hope, not when my most loyal men had been ambushed by cowards. Their murderers needed to burn during their funeral. I didn't know the exact identity of my ambushers, but that didn't matter. An upstart group or other, trying to make themselves a name while trying to take control of the city at the same time. Smart, if they could finish me. If not, I was more than ready to teach them the error of their ways. Provided I didn't die of blood loss first. A sense of vertigo hit me, telling me that I was running out of time. Ah, aging, my biggest enemy, I murmured, unable to help but compare the moment to my past, where I had ignored far worse ailments as I rushed forward, spreading death and calling it justice. Folly of youth. As I took another sharp turn, I started to look for a spot that I could use to pull an ambush. It was a tall order. 1 against 3 was hardly favorable odds even without including the mismatch in gear, but it was better than being nailed by a bullet on my back while I ran like a coward. Or worse, captured alive. Technically, surrendering was my best option to live. I had many favors I could call, and still had several friends who would make sure to avenge me if I ended up dead. But, that would mean trusting the mercy of the ones that killed my most loyal men, my family. And I'd rather die than trust the mercy of a dog. I dashed forward, trying to ignore the existential dread pooling in my stomach as I committed to a last stand. For all my hopes, I knew exactly how it would end once that vertigo hit, telling me that I was out of time to run. I was too old to lie to myself. I took the first stairs I saw, and decided to pull a little trick. I used a second to remove my jacket and, at the same time, stopped pressing my hand to the wound, instead gathering my blood to my palm. A flick, and I created a trail of blood climbing up the stairs, while I pressed my jacket to the wound for it to soak the blood. It was not a trick that would fool them for long. As long as they reached the second floor, they would realize there was no blood, and check the other side. The basement, where I would be trapped. It was a desperate gamble. Maybe I would be able to find a cover that could actually hold back military-grade ammunition, and if a miracle happened, they might even split up. However, I doubted that would happen. They had already committed that mistake once, which reduced their numbers to 3 from the original 5. Not bad for a bleeding old man. Too bad the others were too close for me to get one of their weapons, leaving me to rely on a half-depleted pistol. I dashed through the dark corridor, wondering whether there was a problem with the lights, or it was the bloodlust that was finally getting too much. I looked for a suitable location for a last stand when I heard a loud swear, no doubt my assassins noticing my trick. I occasionally slowed down to check the rooms, but they were filled with books. Good for concealment, and if I wasn't wounded, I would have considered it. But I needed a more solid cover, so I searched desperately. Luckily, the corridor wasn't a straight one, but with some twists and turns, keeping me out of their field of view even as their footsteps got closer. Then, I opened a door, and froze. I met with an unexpected sight. A young man, tall and bespectacled, standing in front of some kind of glowing light, hypnotized by the sight of it. The glow itself was beautiful and mysterious, white mixing with purple, and a bunch of other colors that I never thought to exist. The boy was clearly just another student, and if his bright-colored bag with a drawn cartoon character was any indicator, not a particularly mature one. He walked calmly, not reacting to the sudden appearance of a bleeding old man. He was in a trance, not controlling his actions. He took another step, and his hand disappeared into the light. I couldn't help but tense. I was not exactly a believer of any religion, or the supernatural in general, but what I had in front of me was different. Maybe it was just the blood loss. Or maybe, it was the miracle I was looking for. My general lack of faith didn't stop me from dashing forward. Had no idea what was going on, but I liked the odds better than the desperate last stand I had been planning. As I got closer, I could somehow feel that the glowing light was a portal. I ignored the rational part of my mind claiming it was just a toy, a glitch, an illusion due to blood loss. The closer I got, the stronger those feelings got, soon reaching strong enough to overcome my fear of death. I should keep away from that light, that it was harmful, that it was unfair for me to jump, that I would damn myself. Thoughts that I wouldn't consider, allowing me to identify them as external. So, I ignored the growing sense of rejection and dashed forward, ignoring the sense of unworthiness. It was interesting, but not as interesting as the 3 assassins getting closer and closer. Then, I grabbed the shoulder of the student and pulled desperately. I had no idea what would happen to him, but ignoring those moral implications was even easier. I had lived long enough to face the truth of myself. I had worked hard to keep people in my territory safe, struggled to save the lives of my men, and always respected others. But, facing the choice between my own life and a stranger, the choice was always clear. Above anything, I was a survivor. With that, even as I heard the gunshots behind me thankfully coming as a panic spray, only a few hitting me, I threw myself into the portal, ignoring the pain blossoming in my body. And light invaded my vision, blinding me before the pain. Then, a line of text appeared in my vision. Class acquired, hero. I didn't know how long I stayed in the sea of light. A second. An eternity. Slowly, however, I was able to pin down that the time wasn't moving just as fast, but it was a sensation of drunkenness. It was strong, stronger than any drink I tasted, enough to enrapture me if it wasn't for the combined effects of the adrenaline rush and the pain of my wounds. Interestingly, the moment I stepped into the light, the sensation of rejection vanished. It disappeared completely, almost like it didn't exist in the first place and I imagined it. I should have felt fascinated by the dancing colors around me, more impressive than the best firework show I had seen, but a lifetime of practicality forced me to focus on more practical aspects. Like how I managed to end up in the tunnel of light. Whoever or whatever was responsible for the portal was clearly not omnipotent. If they had been, they could have done something more effective to keep me away than trying to play with my thoughts or emotions to make me take such a decision. However, even as I processed that, I turned my attention to the other significant detail. 2 lines of text that appeared in my sight, immediately after the first line about class awakening disappeared. Class, hero. Level, 0. I had no idea what that text meant, or required any kind of action from me. I might have tried to decipher them, but I had a more urgent issue to deal with. My wounds, still bleeding. I started ripping my shirt, as quickly as I could manage in my current condition, trying to fashion out some bandages to stem the blood. It would be the height of irony if the blood loss ended me as I continued to float through the magical tunnel. Yet, even as I ripped the first bandage, I realized something was wrong. The shirt was made of a silk and cotton blend, and while it was not impossible to rip such a fabric, it required a considerable amount of strength. Yet, it put up less resistance than paper from my tug. I raised the fabric, only to realize it was thin and frayed, like it was a 20-year-old shirt used in heavy duty rather than a new one. In a panic, I raised my hand, looking at my fingers, afraid that somehow the tunnel was rejecting me. It was still the same old, wrinkly skin, with no hint of weakening, not above the effect of the constant blood loss. I had something else to check. I turned my attention to my gun and my watch, only to see both had lost their luster, and gained a dull, dusty look, almost soft. I grabbed the gun and pressed it, only for it to shatter in my palm like foam. It was an interesting concept, especially as I noted certain parts of my suit had already disintegrated completely. But I was too practical to miss the implications for my wounds, desperately pressing one hand to my shoulder, and the other to my thigh. If everything else was disintegrating, the bullets would as well, and the bullets buried there were helping to plug the wounds they had created. Their disappearance would only mean faster blood flow. And just like that, I found myself floating in some kind of trippy river of light, desperately hoping that I would arrive to the destination before the blood loss ended me. I didn't pay attention to the burning letters in front of me as I turned my gaze to my surroundings, hoping to find something to distract me from the desire to fall asleep. As the adrenaline rush slowly disappeared, it left exhaustion behind, compounded by the exhaustion of the blood loss. Adding in the drug-like effect of the tunnel to my already ragged state turned the simple task of staying awake into one of the hardest challenges of my life. I ignored everything else, focusing on the singular task of staying alive. I had grown up as an orphan during the war, I had overcome betrayals, I had survived starvation, I had fought and bled until I had built an empire of shadows from nothing. Sleep was just another enemy to be vanquished. As I struggled, a little line popped in front of me. Stat potential awakened, resilience. Accept/reject. Accept, I muttered, with absolutely no idea what such a thing meant, but hoped that it might somehow help me. It didn't, at least not in a way that I could actually notice. Maybe they were just a hallucination, a flicker I was seeing as the blood loss had become too much. Either way, I focused on staying awake while pressing my wounds as I floated, death creeping ever closer. Lost in the haze, I barely managed to resist the call of sleep. As I got closer to unconsciousness, I could see some kind of shadow, peering through the light, but it was impossible to decipher whether it was not just an illusion. Not with my gaze darkening with each second. Then, I felt something solid under my feet. It only lasted for a fleeting moment, making me think that it was just a dream. Only after it was followed by a painful collusion, I realized it was me that toppled down, too weak to stand up. While I wondered if that was the end, I heard a cry nearby. "What's going on? He's not supposed to be wounded," shouted a voice. A voice that was not speaking in any language that I knew, yet somehow understood perfectly. "Quick, transfer some health to him before he dies," shouted a second voice. At least someone was trying to help me. I did nothing, just lay on the ground, my eyes closed. Not because I wanted to keep them closed, but because opening them was more than I could manage in my exhausted state. The most I was able to focus on, other than the pointless cries, was the texture of the surface under me. Some kind of metal, cold and flawless, yet hot at the same time. "Are we sure we want to save him?" said the first one. "Look at him, so old and frail. Maybe we should just get rid of him." "And what, beg the lords to give us another set of keys for free so we can conduct another summoning? Is your family willing to pay the cost? Can you take the responsibility to identify another gap to summon one before the breach happens?" the second one argued. Those two fought, but I could hear others at a distance, moving but staying silent. "I don't have to," started the first voice, nasal and annoying, before being interrupted by another, a third voice. "Enough bickering, Falale. He's dying. We can decide whether he's eligible after healing him," the third voice said, though I realized that it was a distant voice, with some echo, almost like coming from a phone. Still, I feel that, unlike the first and second, it was sharper, and more confident. Clearly used to throw out commands. "But how?" the first one, identified as Falale. He doesn't have any health to be replenished. They don't have any levels on the other side of the gate. Then, wake him up, and let him kill something and make him level up. Do I have to explain everything to you, you pathetic worm, said the commanding one. I might have tried to speak, but I made no sound, too busy listening to their incompetent bickering. It wouldn't be the first time faking unconsciousness would have granted me a critical piece of information. We don't have anything here, but I can ask the stables, Falael started, only to be interrupted by the second voice. Use that frost beast you had acquired. It should give him enough to level up, said the second voice, with a vindictiveness that I recognized even at the edge of death. I can't use it. I had just acquired it. We don't know if it'll even give enough experience for a level up. And, it's a waste to destroy it before it grew enough to grant an ability, Falael tried to explain in shock. Enough, do it, or your family will be responsible for paying for the next set of keys, the illusory voice ordered. As you order, High Priest, Falael admitted defeat, and I felt footsteps getting closer. I felt a dagger being pushed into my hand, yet I lacked the strength to even grab it. They treated me as unconscious, didn't bother asking me anything, and lifted my arm. It was a weird treatment, but considering I was brought there in some kind of magical tunnel, I was willing to trust them about their unusual method of treatment. Not like I had any other options. I lacked the strength to hold the dagger, but it somehow stayed stuck in my hand as my hand lifted. Then, he brought my arm down, and it sank into some kind of flesh, a beast, if the type of roar was any indicator. Another line of text appeared in my field of vision. Plus 1836 experience. At the same time, I felt some kind of bath salts under my nose, stronger and more disgusting than anything else I had smelt, enough to wake me up even if I had been sleeping. Level up, he had ordered to me, his tone carrying a dismissive order, still annoyingly nasal. I had worked with many people during my life, sometimes leading, sometimes following. Yet very rarely I had heard such a casual, horrible tone when giving up an order. Yet, maybe he didn't need to use a commanding tone, because, suddenly, my mind was filled with a desire to follow his order. A flash of desire, one that was similar to the sensation I had received at the portal, though much stronger. Or I was too weak, struggling at the edge of death. I focused on leveling up. That was all I was able to do, the desire filling my head like an instinctual feeling, difficult to resist. Maybe even impossible. 100 experience. Level up. Stat points plus 10. Another set of text that I could not understand, but before I could think about them, another order arrived, snotty and nasal, yet impossible to resist. Assign your stat points. I thought about that, and 3 other lines appeared. Stat points, 10. Plus 5 vitality. Plus 5 resilience. And, along with it, a sense of warmth spread into my body, one that I had never felt for a long time. A sense of stirring, and some kind of absence of pain. Not from my wounds, though they lessened significantly, but all the small aches that filled my body, accumulated through a long life filled with struggle. A miracle, but that was nothing compared to what followed when he poured a small bottle of liquid down my throat. Another line appeared. Plus 1 health. Heal yourself, came another order, once again with a mental weight. Yet, there was something different at this time. Earlier, whenever he gave an order, it echoed deep in my soul, filling me with a forceful kind of desire to follow it. This time, the same weight still came, but not as directly, like there was some kind of barrier between me and the weight that accompanied the order. Still, I followed it. 1 health. And just like that, I felt a stirring in my wounds, all the intensity of one bandaged for 2 weeks, concentrated into 1 second. The most annoying yet amazing sensation I had ever experienced. For a moment, I ignored everything and focused on the warmth spreading from my stomach after each sip of the mysterious liquid that they were forcing me to drink, filling my whole body. It was not just my wounds that closed with an incredible speed, but every sign of blood loss disappeared as well. Plus 1 health. 1 health. All while those 2 lines popped in occasionally. The silver lining, I didn't need to fear that the liquid was poisoned or drugged. Not with their magic voice more than enough for the task. My short, continuous breaths filled the room as I was busy processing the miracle that was happening in real time, more than enough for sainthood. Especially since it was not just my wounds that were disappearing, but also all the little pains and aches that accompanied me for years, all the evidence of a misspent youth. I wondered if it was a permanent change or something temporary. What a waste, maybe we should, said someone at a distance, before one of the other servants poked and silenced him, sending a worried glance at me. A detail that I was happy to see. If they were worried about what I would hear, it meant they didn't have anything sinister for me, at least, not immediately. However, soon, I ignored the miraculous nature of my healing and focused on my arrival here, hijacked by someone else. The brief discussion I had heard showed that they had summoned that unlucky student for a purpose, likely linked to all the weird numbers that were popping in my vision. The title of a hero was rather telling. There were no thoughts of rejecting the deal they were offering to me, no matter how unfair, as their earlier talk showed that they had the ability to get rid of me and find someone else, stopped only by the cost of doing so. I decided to play along. The first step, looking like I was easy to manipulate. I didn't know whether it was one of their requirements, but I suspected so. Otherwise, they wouldn't have tried to call someone from a college, an institution that was famous for pointlessly coddling anyone that attended, with no idea how the real world worked. And it was easier to fix the misconception later on if they revealed that they were searching for someone less idealistic. It was time to give them a first impression. I raised my gaze and started looking around, pushing an expression of fascinated confusion on my face, like I was a boorish tourist that accidentally walked into a fancy party filled with celebrities. There was an art to faking personalities, and that started from ignoring my first instincts. I forced myself not to focus on their weapons and their gazes despite all my instincts shouting at me otherwise, and instead focused on the fancy items in the background. Conveniently, the background gave me a lot to focus on: marble walls foiled with several gleaming metals that looked similar to gold and silver, but certainly different. The way they reflected the light was wrong for pure gold and silver, or any of the alloys he was familiar with. The walls filled with weapons that looked too ornate to be useful in the battlefield, and various stylized drawings of monsters. Even when I looked at the men that surrounded me, I tried to focus on their clothes rather than their expressions, doing my best to further sell their initial impression. All the while, I kept my body lax, suppressing my reflexes so as not to react to anything in an undue manner that would hint that I was a dangerous man. A minute passed as I put a play for my audience, my body feeling more and more amazing with each passing second. And, just as I felt like I could run a marathon, the notifications I was receiving changed. +1 health. +1 health. +1 health. Where am I? I asked, doing my best to sound fascinated and confused. Luckily, only the first part one needed to fake. We will answer that soon enough, Falale said as he grabbed my arm and helped me to stand up. Only then, I paid attention to him. A man in his 40s, with a considerable belly, reminded me of one of those government employees that dealt with their lack of ambition with food. Yet, I didn't miss the fact that, as he helped me up, he didn't show even the slightest hint of discomfort. To test it, I acted like I lost my footing and put my full weight on his arm. If I tried the same against one of my bodyguards, the least they would receive was a sprained wrist. He didn't even register it as he waited, his wrist immovable, and a servant rushed toward us, carrying a white robe. I looked down and then dipped my head, acting flustered as if I had just noticed my nudity. Yet, before he put the robe on, the servant touched me with some kind of device. A different sensation crawled over my skin, even as a layer of soft light appeared on the surface, removing any sign of blood and dirt. "Let's walk," he said as he accompanied me to a side room, leaving the huge chamber behind. One other person accompanied us, and a short corridor later, we arrived at the next location, a smaller room, but only relatively. The previous room was as big as a cathedral, while the current room was more of an ordinary church. Nothing but a huge table going through the center, filled with food, some familiar, most foreign. Food that smelt more delicious than I ever smelled in my life. That put a smile on my face, not due to sudden gluttony, though I did my best to give that impression to my observers, but it was just another confirmation that they were trying to embrace the soft sail. "What do you remember?" Falale asked, after I sat down, though this time, his words were once again accompanied by that subtle pressure, wrapping around me, forcing me to tell the truth, and nothing but the truth. Yet, once again, there was a sense of distance between that sensation and my mind, a thin layer that protected me. Not fully, as I doubted that I could actually lie to them. I was in a library, and there was a portal of light, of many colors, calling for a hero. I started, doing my best to sound slightly confused. He nodded, giving me my first sense of victory, confirming that he was confident in that magical effect he was reflecting. Enough not to bother correcting my little omission about who the portal was calling. "And what else? Why were you wounded? Did someone attack you in the tunnel?" "No," I said with a tremble. "It happened back in my world. 3 gang members were in the library," chasing someone as they fired their weapons indiscriminately, accidentally hitting many people. I was a target as well, I explained. Don't worry, you're safe now, another voice said, once again accompanied by that weird pressure, but this time begging me to have some favorable impressions about the speaker. I recognized his voice as the second person that was speaking, who did his best to look kind but only came across as smug as he examined my expression. Thank you. But what is happening? I uttered, doing my best to look overwhelmed. I'm just an old, unemployed man, who decided to enter the library for some safety, I said, leveraging the lack of pressure to slip some misleading truths and almost lies. I was certainly old and entered the library for some safety, and technically, at least according to the government, I was unemployed as well. You have been chosen for a great destiny, Falale said. He tried to sound grand, but his tone was exactly the same when I assigned a young and enthusiastic criminal to a horrible job with a nice title. He was confident that I would eat it up. Not that I blamed him. Even without the magical pressure that accompanied his voice, it was a strong sell. A magical portal with a drugging sensation, floating crystals, gold and silver, or at least some magical variants everywhere. It was a strong, convincing story. I had just lived enough to know that, if someone was trying to sell a shiny object quickly, it often hid a beautiful con. What destiny? I asked. That'll be explained the day after tomorrow, by the princess herself, the second one said, though interestingly, his voice didn't carry that necessity to force me to accept. For now, let's not think about it, and enjoy your food. Good idea, I said as I reached for a piece of meat, filling my mouth with an incredible flavor, but even as I did, their expression was filled with a certain sense of distaste, a subtle one, so I acted unaware, and chewed it down. Only for it to grant me another notification. +1 health. It's happening again, I muttered. Something called health is increasing. Don't worry about it, it's just a part of the system. All will be explained later. Now, let's just enjoy the amazing food, Falale said, whose words, unlike the second one, slammed with all the weight of an immutable order. Why should I worry about anything when I was safe, and with friends, enjoying the most glorious food I had ever tasted? I found myself thinking as I took a bite from a peach-like fruit, another line of writing appearing occasionally, informing me about increased health. Only halfway into that peach, the sensation disappeared enough for me to push it away, leaving only a chill behind. Yet, I didn't slow down my eating, acting more than happy to be entertained by the food as they said absolutely nothing. I didn't probe further, as they were clearly not interested in explaining further. And any crumpets of information I might get were not worth revealing my very limited ability to ignore their magical suggestions. I didn't grow up to be an old criminal by letting impatience rule me. Is there anything else I can do for you, great hero? The servant said after he led me to my room, a huge, opulent room, decorated as lavishly as anything else, but I noted that, unlike everywhere else, there were no decorative weapons on the walls, instead replaced by huge paintings. Paintings that shared fascinating themes. Each painting showed 5 men, fighting against some kind of horde. Not all hordes were the same, some showed scenes filled with ghouls and zombies, while others had dragon-like huge monsters filling the painting. One even showed some kind of metal machines, though too far different than the tanks and planes that he was used to, impossible to truly assess. No, you can leave, I said in a dreamlike tone as I focused on the paintings until I heard him slam the door and leave. I stayed locked at the paintings, not because I was truly interested in the scenes they deciphered, but due to the subtle sense of attraction that radiated from them. It wasn't as intense as the one that was radiating off their voice, but still captivating enough to pull me in, and the more I watched, the more my heart stirred to be just like theirs. A feeling that I might have felt when I was still a young, hot-blooded man, but in my 60s. No, I didn't need the sense of barrier between me and the magical pressure to recognize the foreign intrusion. What an insidious way of brainwashing, I thought in fascination. I continued watching, but it wasn't the sensation of attraction that made me look at them, but the fear that I might have been under observation. Who could guarantee that they didn't have security cameras or something equivalent? My eyes locked on the paintings to trick any observer, but my mind drifted forward, trying to decipher what was waiting for me. They didn't tell me much, but the pictures showed that some kind of battle was waiting for me. I might have questioned why, but the sudden sense of power that two earned when they helped me to kill that monster and asked me to level up gave a good idea, especially when combined with the name of my class. Hero. A lofty call and a declaration if there was any. I remembered that killing the monster had given me a lot of experience, and I wondered if that would allow me to level up again. I tried to focus on that sensation, but without his order, I found it more difficult to do than I had expected. Level up, I whispered instead. Dash 400 experience. Level up. Stat points plus 10. Amazing, I thought as I felt a glow surrounding my body, filling me with a radiant sense of potential, but nothing else. I remembered the other aspect, assigning stat points. Dash 1 stat points. Plus 1 resilience. And just like that, I could feel that the attraction from the paintings getting lesser. Or, more accurately, the attraction stayed the same, but it got more distant, as a blinding light bulb dragged away by a few feet. Still bright, but much less impactful. Immediately, I assigned the rest to resilience as well. In a new world, where everywhere was filled with objects and people that could casually throw out mind-affecting powers, the ability to resist them was indispensable for me. No matter how promising the name of vitality was. Dash 9 stat points. Plus 9 resilience. Yet, even as I assigned the points, I could hear people rushing forward, their footsteps as loud as thunder as they moved forward, their speed fast enough to rival a car. I decided to try leveling up once more, in case they had other objectives. To my surprise, it worked excellently. Dash 900 experience. Level up. Stat points plus 10. I immediately thought about assigning them equally to vitality and resilience. I would have preferred to add all to resilience, but I hoped that the increase of vitality would be enough to trick them. Whether it would actually do so was a different question. Dash 10 stat points. Plus 5 resilience. Plus 5 vitality. 2 changes happened simultaneously. One was mental, a copy of the earlier. A subtle sense of separation from the other order, one that reduced the impact of the portraits even more, allowing me to pinpoint the concept even more. The second one was a sense of warmth spreading across my body, one that warmed my body like the first sip of coffee, sending a sense of awakening and elation. My aches had already disappeared before, but now, I was feeling even more alert. However, that was the extent I could pay attention to the changes. Before the glow of leveling up even disappeared, the door burst open, hitting the wall like thunder. 2 familiar figures entered. Philael and the tall nameless one, both had their weapons drawn. I took a fearful step back, and made a show of stumbling as I put my hand on my heart, breathing quickly as I did my best to look like I was having a panic attack. Yet, even as I did so, I noticed them looking around the room rather than focusing on me, searching for some kind of threat. What happened? Tell me, Philael said, his voice accompanied by the same weighted sensation to force me to obey his command. Unlike his earlier gentle coaxing, it hit like a truck, accompanied by a primal sense of fear to force me to the truth. However, with my increased resilience, the effect just bounced away ineffectively from that ephemeral barrier, making it useless. A detail that he failed to notice. I was looking at the pictures, dreaming to be a hero like them, just as strong, and I leveled up again? I murmured, giving a mixture of fear and excitement as I explained as quickly as possible. How, where did you get the experience? Philael asked, while the nameless one continued to poke around the room. The first beast I killed, I muttered. What, really? How much experience did it grant? He asked, though this time, it wasn't accompanied by that pressure. I thought about underselling the amount, to hide the fact that I leveled twice. But, watching their actions, I decided against it. The speed they reacted implied that they were aware of my level up, but their focus on exploring the room suggested that they might not be watching the room in real time. I had a feeling that they had the ability to detect me leveling up. Maybe the glow wasn't just light, but some kind of magical noise as well. It was just my speculation, but still, it was enough to push them into a new stage. Something like 2000, I admitted truthfully. I didn't expect their reaction. Taras, I'll kill you. You definitely cost me an ability. Philael growled as he turned toward him, and took a step forward. I took a step back and looked for cover in case a fight broke out. I didn't want to die in the chaos of their squabble. The second one, Taras, didn't look scared in the slightest. Oh, I would love for you, especially without your pesky guards to help you, he answered, smug and eager as he grabbed his sword. Just throw the first blow, I beg of you. Hey, guys, maybe you should wait until later? I said. I have a feeling that I won't survive long if you start fighting. They looked at me in frustration, and I gave them an exaggerated flinch, putting a front of panic rather than measured concern. The more they ignored me, the better. Good point, Philael admitted with a sigh. Still, mark my words, I'll make you pay one day. Oh, I would love it, Taras answered, his smile even more eager before he turned to me. "What did you do with your stat points?" he asked. "I assigned them to vitality." "All of them," I said. Lying there was a risk, but trying to act like I had any free points available had its own risks. Either way, it was a blind choice. Taras walked toward me, and without even asking for permission, put his hand on my shoulder. A flicker of energy flew into my body, and I felt a weird sensation rising from my body to fight against it. It didn't wound me, but it targeted that unique sense of warmth that appeared earlier, and cut a piece from it. -1 health. When he pulled, there was a soft, crimson glow on his finger, radiating a gentle warmth. But, rather than enjoying the miraculous sight, I focused on their face, exploring their expression. "Very good," Falail said as he looked at the glow, and to his credit, he managed to sound halfway convincing. I was too experienced to miss the undertone. They were clearly unhappy with the result. Remembering the discussion between them about possibly getting rid of me and trying again, I prepared myself to admit the truth if they decided to take action on that. They didn't. "Clearly not a warrior," Taras murmured in disappointment. "What do you think, test for commanding potential, or should we ask for a magic trainer? I think we don't have to bore our guest with such discussion while he's still exhausted, and wants to sleep. Right?" he said, uttering the last word as he turned to me, once again accompanied by that pressure. "All right," I nodded immediately, and watched them as they walked away. Just before they left completely, Falail turned to me. "You are sure that you assigned all 30 stat points, right?" he said, his words once again accompanied by the pressure. One that I loved, because the moment I gave him a positive answer, he nodded in agreement. "Good, and make sure never to level up without one of us being present, and never accept any stats or assign points to them without confirming with us. It's very important for your future," he said, his words once again accompanied by a suffocating wave of obedience. I nodded, acting like I took his words seriously, and he left, completely confident that he managed to extract the truth from me. As I lay down in my bed, sleepless, I found myself trying to decide what to do, but it was hard to do when my information was limited. All I knew was that I was in some kind of magic world, summoned to fight against some kind of great danger. Or at least, that was the impression they were trying to give me. My only advantage, my ability to lie. "I have handled worse odds," I muttered as I buried my face in the pillow. I didn't try to sleep. I didn't want to lose precious thinking time. And, more importantly, I wasn't exhausted. With my vitality increased, I was feeling more energetic than I had felt in years, feeling like I could go without sleep for days. I lay in my bed, wondering whether it was day or night, the lack of windows leaving me wondering about that detail. Or this new world had a concept of day and night in the first place, showing just how little I knew about the new world I had found myself in. Cycling over the same deficient set of information over and over was useless. Maybe even dangerous if I managed to drift down to a dangerous set of assumptions as I worked too hard on the same set of information. First, this mysterious system that seemed to be determined to grant me supernatural powers. I tried to focus on the direction, concentrating on the concept of level, power, and other texts, trying to reach and find some kind of screen where I could access my information. I didn't know if such a screen existed, but I still tried to do that. Not like I had anything urgent to do. Then, after 5 minutes of struggle, I managed to trigger what I was searching for. Class, Hero. Level, 3. Experience, 0/1400. Health, 49 out of 100. Experience, 436. Stats. Resilience, 20. Vitality, 10. Locked. Stat points, 0. Skills. Abilities. Fascinating, I murmured, a bit louder than necessary to see if anyone would react to my words. A crude way of seeing if anyone was actually observing my presence. Absent of any reaction, I turned my attention to the writing that appeared in my sight. The level was easy to decipher. The experience was some kind of fuel or material, and at least one of those methods of acquiring was killing monsters, and after collecting enough, it could be used to get some kind of general improvement. Improvement that gave me the miracle that was known as stat points, just a handful of them assigned to vitality enough to make me more alive than I had felt for the last 20 years. And that was not even touching the role it showed on my mind-bending healing performance. Then there was resilience, which was even more important than vitality. I could handle the frailty of my old age much better than a lack of resistance against mental pressure. Spilling every little secret I had for the convenience of the others just by a simple mental pressure was the worst thing imaginable. I would rather die. No dark thoughts, I muttered as I stood up, and started walking around the room, hoping to come across something useful. Only to come empty. There was a huge wardrobe, filled with various clothes, robes, shirts, pants, and lots of cloaks. Unfortunately, every single one of them was made of bright, explosive colors, reds, greens, yellows, and blues, cross-cut with many different metal filings. None of them were particularly subtle. I decided against changing into them, at least for the moment. At least the robe was loose enough that I could actually smuggle something under it if I came across it. The walk around the room gave nothing else. There were no weapons, no books, and no other drawings than the inspirational paintings that covered every single wall of the large room. One last thing before leaving, I decided. I wanted to test my body before leaving. I lay down, curious about just how many push-ups I could achieve before my new body called quits. The answer turned out to be a lot, as I repeated the same attempt again and again. Pushing my body wasn't particularly easier than what I was used to, showing that my strength was, more or less, the same. The disappointment didn't last long, as I realized something was different when I passed 10, the point that I would normally start to get exhausted. I blew past 20 easily, then 50, then 100. Without even my breathing quickening. Then, something popped into my view. Stat potential awakened, strength. Accept/reject. A fascinating improvement, I murmured as I accepted it, but even as I continued, there was no difference in my capabilities. Suggesting that I need at least 1 point assigned to see the difference. Then, I stopped. First, I started listening, curious whether they would rush inside, just like the time I leveled up, but there were no movements. Still, I didn't continue. Push-ups wouldn't be an accurate measure of understanding my limits. Still, it was clear that vitality granted me an amazing improvement in endurance. Not so much for power, which clearly relied on its own stat or possibly stats. Curious whether the same applied to the agility and whether I could actually awaken that, I looked around, searching for something I could use to do some tricks, a knife, a coin, anything. In the end, I found a small, thick piece of metal that was similar to a coin. I put it between my fingers, and let it dance between my fingers with small flicks, until it disappeared in my palm. Not too much of a difference as well, I murmured. It flowed smoother than I expected, but only marginally. Nothing like the great improvement I had just experienced due to strength. Maybe it was the lack of challenge. I grabbed several small objects, and started juggling them, adding one after the other. Unlike coin tricks, which I was used to doing whenever I got bored, it had been a long while since I had juggled since I was a teenager. Yet, it still gave me what I was searching for. Stat potential awakened, agility. Accept/reject. I accepted that again, fascinated by the ease they were being awakened. Maybe it was just something easy to do for everyone, or maybe it was something about my class. Either way, my quick tests were complete. I didn't even bother to change my robe as I walked to the door, checking to see if it was locked. It was not, but whether it was not supposed to be locked, or they forgot while leaving, too distracted by their bickering, was another question. Still, I waited for another hour before leaving the room, going through the place in great detail to see if I could find anything useful in the room. A waste of time, I decided as I took a step into the corridor after pushing the door open gently, waiting for the 2 Minders to burst, questioning me about why I ignored their order. My excuse was ready. I would say that I was searching for a bathroom. I had already discovered the small one at the corner of the room, separated by a small door, but I was ready to play the ignorant savage and act like I failed that. I walked through the corridor, the walls covered with weapons and paintings in equal amounts. I ignored the temptation of trying to get one from the wall, not wanting to deal with possibly magical measures of security there to prevent sticky fingers. Everything was technically possible. As I walked, it didn't take long for me to discover the reason for the lack of response. Taras and Philael were around a table filled with half-empty bottles, their heads against the table. No wonder they didn't react. Still, I tried not to make much noise. I continued walking, not daring to get closer. I had no idea how their magical abilities worked, and I wasn't ready to test them properly. Instead of waiting, however, I continued walking. The next door I came across was a library, a modest one, but still far more than I could hope. The first promise of knowledge. I still walked forward. Even if there was an alarm, I would try to swipe one. I was getting more and more excited as I walked, ready to grab a book and stuff under my robe if I heard their furious footsteps. The longer their reaction lasted, the more relaxed I felt, and soon, I stood in front of the first shelf, and pulled the first book, flipping it open excitedly. Only for my hope to die as I looked at the page, filled with nothing but complicated symbols. Maybe it's just for this book, I murmured as I placed it back and checked the next one, only to experience the same thing. I checked more than a dozen books, each filled with the same type of runic letters that I couldn't understand. Either I stumbled across an esoteric library filled with unknown languages, or whatever magical feature that allowed me to speak the foreign language didn't extend to the written word. Inconvenient, I thought as I left the library. As much as the information hidden there was tempting, I didn't want to lose the window of opportunity one was dealing with. I walked forward, checking the other doors. I passed a huge set of gates, one that I remembered leaving, one that led into the huge room I was summoned to, firmly closed, just like most other doors on the way. I didn't try to open the locked doors, seeing it as a pointless risk. Worst, I could try to do so while returning to my room, if I couldn't find anything on my way. I continued to walk, checking every room with an open door, but most looked like residences, not too dissimilar to hotel rooms, small yet functional. Though, of every room I had seen, mine was by far the best, which made me glad. The softer they treated me, the more it meant that they needed something that I could give them. All I needed was not to give them any ideas. Things wouldn't be fun if they decided to get rid of me to summon another hero. Still, I wonder why they don't fear me escaping if I'm this precious for them, I murmured as I finally reached the end of the corridor and found two things. A huge spiral stair, going both up and down, and a large balcony at the end of the corridor. At a glance, I could see that it was nighttime outside, with only a very soft glimpse of light entering inside. Still, since it was open, I first walked to the balcony, curious about the new world I found myself in. Only to gasp in shock as I took my step to the balcony. No wonder they are not afraid of me running away, I murmured in fascination. Escaping from a castle, one that was flying in the sky with a speed that might rival a plane, might not be too easy of a job. A flying castle, I murmured as I glanced around, fascinated yet scared by the idea. I shouldn't have. The idea of several thousand tons of rock and marble flying through the air was not a concept I couldn't understand. Just a big, huge, magical helicopter, nothing against the miracle of taking me to a different world, or somehow rewriting my whole biology. Maybe it was why it scared me. Teleporting to a different world was something mystical, an event that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. A flying castle that probably weighed as much as an aircraft carrier, was the kind of miracle that I could understand, both in terms of strategic deterrence, and the amount of sheer force that was required to keep it floating. Enough to make me feel stirrings of cold, calculated fear, the kind that I hadn't felt even when I was a young man, and found myself as the target of the majority of the underworld due to a chain of unfortunate circumstances. No despair, I muttered as I turned my attention to my surroundings. I didn't have the luxury of throwing a pity party. I turned my attention to the castle once more, but this time, focusing on the details rather than the concept. The first thing I noticed was some kind of energy field that surrounded the castle almost a quarter of a mile away from the castle itself. It wasn't always visible, flaring occasionally at different intensities, in different shades of purple. For the first few repeats, I failed to see the reason for it flaring up, but then, I noticed a large, winged shadow bursting through the clouds, too fast for me to get a glimpse of the darkness concealing it. It slammed against the shield, only for its wings to freeze, disappearing as quickly as it arrived. Dangerous world, I murmured, not for a second considering that winged thing was a peaceful creature going around its business. Instead, I focused on examining how the shield reacted, and it flared fully, across the whole surface, giving me a clue about the other flares as well. The castle was constantly under attack. Maybe it was more like an aircraft carrier than I had given it credit for. Then, as I peered into the darkness, another notification appeared in my view. Stat potential awakened, perception. Accept/reject. It was a pity I didn't trust my summoners as far as I could throw them, I considered even as I accepted the notification that popped into my sight, but the names were promising enough, so I still accepted. After watching the chaos for a while, I turned my attention back to the castle itself. A large, tall building, with thick walls made of some kind of stone, pure white and glowing. It created an imposing sight, and the number of balconies it had around the upper levels suggested that they were more interested in making an impression than actual security. They clearly trusted their magical measures enough not to have any concerns. Then, I focused on examining the layout, in case it might be useful. I was currently on the penultimate floor, with only one, imposing-looking floor above me, but it was decorated with two huge, imposing towers, several hundred feet tall, positioned at the two corners I could see from the balcony. I assumed the other two corners had identical towers as well. The soft, purple glow they let out just before the appearance of the shield suggested that they might not be purely decorative. I wondered why they didn't care much about the risk of me throwing myself down and ruining all their efforts, but discovering the answer didn't take long. When I tried to reach out, my fingers hit against some kind of force field, invisible, but just as solid. Maybe the balconies weren't as big of a security risk as I had first assumed. I continued examining, but with no movement from outside, that was all I was able to learn. I left the balcony, my mind already on the next destination. With the stairs going both sides, I could go upstairs, or downstairs. At first, I wanted to check the upstairs, curious if I could learn something from the towers, but that attempt was quick to fail. Several steps, I came across a huge gate, blocking the way, with no clear way to open up. Downstairs, it was. The towers looked impressive, and likely contained many mysteries, but I knew too little to ever dig into those mysteries. Downstairs promised to be less dangerous, especially if I could come across the rest of the crowd that was present in my summoning. Maybe I could come across a few chatty servants, enough to dig into their general attitude. Unfortunately, that little ploy ended up prematurely. The moment I was halfway, I was noticed by an armored soldier, one of the 5 that was waiting at the other end of the stairs, their stances suggesting that their presence was neither coincidental nor temporary. They were sitting in a circle before I had arrived, and when I saw them, they were already pulling their helmets on and jumping to their feet, their movement far too smooth for people wearing bulky-looking armor. I noticed someone pushing a bunch of cards with his feet to a shadowy corner. "Is there something I could help you with, great hero?" the soldier said, his voice clear despite the imposing helmet he was wearing. Too clear to impediment the derision in his tone. To his credit, it was subtle, almost impossible to notice, but I had spent half my life dealing with politicians, like anyone else dealing with darker aspects of the world, and I was too experienced in that attitude to miss it. It certainly contrasted with the title of the great hero. I wondered whether it was just my age and unimposing looks, or the fact that I was a hero. As he delivered his line, the other 4 shifted slightly, not too dissimilar to a bouncer preparing to cut off an unruly customer. I had a feeling that they wouldn't allow me to walk around unaccompanied. "No, I just came here to see the brave men that were responsible for protecting me, and show my respects," I answered, doing my best to sound fawning as I examined their armor, which was, luckily, fancy enough to make such a move justified. They lacked the magical attraction of the paintings, but still, the silver-like metal, decorated aggressively with other metals to make them look more decorative than functional, was enough to look impressive. "I see, it's a great honor for us, great hero. But why did Lord Taras choose not to accompany you?" he said as he looked at me. This time, as he asked the question, the same pressure accompanied his words, though much less intense than Taras, let alone rivaling the suffocating weight of Philael's orders. I wondered if it was just the seriousness he treated it, as Philael had already displayed the ability to vary the pressure based on the importance, or if it was a lack of capability. Hopefully the second, but it was difficult to truly guess. I turned to look upstairs, roughly the same direction as his room was, and shuffled in discomfort, doing my best to reflect second-hand embarrassment. "He was busy, and he saw no problem for me walking alone," I said, implying that he was busy with drinking to bother accompanying me. "Certainly true." "I see, Commander is busy as always," the warrior said, his voice too bitter to be a casual comment. I struggled to hold my smirk in control. The arguments between Philael and Taras already showed that it was not exactly a cohesive force, but the unhappy attitude of their subordinates toward them was even better. Nothing I could use immediately, but knowing their existence gave me hope. Maybe I could use them to my benefit before we arrived at our destination. "It's hard to handle a long journey," I said. "Yes, a week away from the capital is far too long for our exalted commander," whispered one of the other soldiers, mumbling loud enough to be audible to everyone. He was interrupted by a pointed cough, but his grumbling gave me some idea about the time we would travel. At most a week if he was talking about the time they stayed away, though it might be as short as 2 days if they were talking about the full travel time, and the summoning ritual took some time. Either way, that meant I needed to act fast to understand better. Taras already displayed the ability to assess my stats, though limited, and I would have loved to know if there was a chance the capital could get a more detailed breakdown of my stats, maybe the numbers. I had a feeling that revealing my ability to ignore their magical brainwashing wouldn't come across very well, and the soldiers represented the quickest, and possibly only, chance for me to understand how the world worked before I could arrive at their location. Now, a little excuse to stay. Luckily, the little card game they had been playing gave me the opportunity. "Would you mind if I joined you guys for the game?" I said, pointing at the cards that they were playing. "I'm having trouble sleeping," I said. "I don't think it's appropriate," the first soldier, the one that looked like the leader of the other, spoke, just a hint of panic. "Why, it's not like it's forbidden, right?" I said innocently, their shuffling confirming that it was definitely something frowned upon. "Of course not," one of the soldiers said, far too intensely to deliver an innocent statement. "But I'm sure the commander is waiting for you to return. He can always come to visit if he feels so, can't he?" I said. "Come on guys, a little game to pass a sleepless night. A little favor for what do you guys call me, a great hero, isn't too much, right?" I paused as they looked at each other. "Maybe we could even put some money on the game if you are alright with extending some credit for me. I should be able to make some money once I receive my position." "I don't think," their leader started, clearly about to reject, only to be stopped by a few pointed coughs coming from his soldiers, clearly tempted by the promise of gambling with a total beginner. "I don't think there's any harm," he changed his words, though his distaste obvious, preferring not to deal with any potential trouble, but didn't want to confront the others about it. "Greed for the win. As always." I glanced around innocently as I took note of the corridor. It was different than the upper floor. Unlike the singular corridor that connected to huge rooms, the corridor split into 3, implying the rooms were smaller and likely less luxurious as well. The walls were still filled with many weapons, though they looked less decorative, and more functional, but that was all I was able to get as I limited myself not to look too suspicious. "Now, it's just a friendly game, just a few denikas to make things more fun, nothing more," their leader muttered as he removed his helmet, revealing an ordinary, middle-aged face, his dirty blonde hair and the large nose the only distinguishing feature. "Maybe a bit more than a few denikas, Captain," said one of the soldiers, black-haired and younger, he revealed as he removed his helmet as well. "1 or 2 skill stones wouldn't be too much. I wouldn't say no to an advanced sword skill." Their leader looked dissatisfied with the idea. "Don't push it," he ordered. But the soldier responded, which was all he was able to say before the leader interrupted. "Silence," he ordered, and I felt another mental pressure. Very soft and subtle, much more difficult to detect it when it was not targeted at me, a soft shuffle rather than an intense pressure. The soldier fell silent, but that did little to prevent his clear frustration. The other soldiers looked between him and the leader, their distaste clear, split between 2. Giving me 2 other pieces of critical information. Resisting the impact of that mental weight might be rarer than I expected, but not impossible, considering I didn't see Falale using it on Taras and I was not the only one that could recognize it being used. "Interesting. Don't worry, Captain," I said, hoping that the term was generic enough to be complimentary regardless of the user. "It's just a friendly game. I'm sure the brave soldiers protecting me wouldn't trick me." "We certainly won't," another soldier answered with a shark-like smirk, showing that they would very much be happy to trick me, their desire to hoodwink a newbie enough to suppress their desire. "You have played Vecna before, right?" The other soldiers exploded in mocking laughter. "What?" he said, confused. "Well, it's the part about coming from another world," I suggested. "Yeah, but it's Vecna, everyone knows that," he defended himself, though that didn't prevent him from looking ashamed. "Maybe, why don't you explain the rules?" "It might be that we have different rules back in my world," I said, giving him an exit. "Of course, great hero," he said, though his tone was still sarcastic as he used my title, confirming that, whatever that hero title was, the absurdity of it was sufficiently known. "Now, the cards. A deck of Vecna has 120 cards, split across 6 suits. Holy, Arcane, Necrotic, Elemental, Control, and Void, representing the 6 main magical energies." One started. "Nonsense, daring to put all elements in one category like that," another soldier grumbled. "It's the church doctrine," the other soldier started, only to be interrupted by their captain once more. "Enough, let's not bore our great hero with theological debate, especially not when we are currently the guests of an archbishop," the captain reminded, a message that was reinforced by the same weight, then turned toward me. "It would be if you don't mention this little argument to anyone, great hero," he said, turning that weight to me. "Of course not," I nodded enthusiastically, like I was completely affected by the pressure, even as I absorbed every little information they were spilling out, glad that they were careless enough not to understand the significance of their idle ramblings. I focused on the rest of the explanation, memorizing the rest of the rules. The game was slightly complicated, somewhere between poker and blackjack, with very limited strategic elements included. Essentially, everyone was handed a hand of 10, and 3 cards open to the center of the deck. Everyone put cards into the middle as they wished, facing up or down as they wished. The objective was to get closest to the 50 without actually passing it, and people played sequentially. There was a raising element to the game as well. The first bet was a denica, and every time someone placed a bet, they could choose to raise the amount, and the following player had to match at least that amount. The game ended when no one wanted to play, the last one to play to the stack winning that stack. Though there were some interesting rules that allowed players to challenge the deck if they think the hand the last player had played made it surpass 50, someone else could take the risk and challenge him. If that happened, everyone else received their bets back, and the challenged player paid double the last bet if the stack actually surpassed 50 and vice versa if the opposite was true. A complicated game, but nothing I can't handle, I said after I made them explain the rules 3 times. I had already understood the rules the first time as a man that owned at least one casino and oversaw many more illegal gambling operations in my life. Understanding a game wasn't particularly challenging, but selling the impression of a slightly feeble man, with more interest than capability. In other words, the perfect mark for them to fleece at their heart's content. Good, then let's start with a practice round, to make sure you warmed up properly. With that, a round of the game was played, with almost no idle chatter in between moves other than their comments. I might have never played the game before, but it didn't take much to realize they were playing very poorly. Wow, it is easy, I murmured as I challenged the last stack, only to win it as well, giving me 2 out of 3 stacks. A spectacular victory based on the constraints of the game and also, a very poor example of being a card shark. It was one of the most standard tricks of the conman's playbook to raise the courage of the newbie by giving him a few hands at first, building up his confidence so that they didn't pull back before leaving a considerable part of their fortune on the table, though, usually, they were much more practiced on that aspect. Their captain didn't look particularly interested in playing the game, but the other soldiers were much more enthusiastic, whether that was about their relative wealth or sense of responsibility, I failed to truly guess. Good, let's start with a few denicas. Captain, why don't you give our great hero some starting funds so he can play properly? The captain frowned, but that was his only reaction as he passed a large pouch, one that weighed about a pound. Here's 100 denicas, a decent start, he said as he looked at the soldiers like he challenged them to say something. They looked a bit disappointed, but not enough to actually say anything, giving me a good impression about the value of the money. It was decent, but not too impressive based on their job. I don't think I'll need any more, I said enthusiastically as I shuffled in my seat, but the captain stood up. I'm going for a patrol, don't make too much of a mess, he warned his soldiers before he started walking, clearly not wanting to be a part of the game. Stuck-up nobles, one of the soldiers whispered, though that was the kind of whisper that didn't care who heard. I acted like I failed to hear it, focusing on the dealer's fingers instead. Unlike the first dealer, his fingers moved with an alacrity that surpassed a professional dealer by a great margin, yet his relatively poor technique suggested that it was not due to practice. My best guess, the stats. Still, I just watched them quickly dealt the hand and we started the first proper round. Let's start small, I said, after the first 2 players played at the center, trying to sound smug as I put 5 denicas to the pile in the middle, and a turned-up card, an 18 of arcane. Very good play, sir, said one of the soldiers and they avoided the pile, doing his best to hide his smile and failed to do so. Instead, I turned my attention toward the next stage, which started a short, yet intense round, followed by the others before the remaining cards were discarded, and shuffled into another set of cards. As I previously said, it's easy, I said, pushing my chest out, giving my best impression of a gullible mark as I looked at the small pile of silvers in front of me. Interestingly, it was not actually coined, but pure metal, each melted and cut into pieces of various weights, starting from quarter denica, which was about 1.5 grams, to a 10 denica piece, weighing about 60 grams. The lack of coinage had some interesting implications about the world, but rather than delving into them, I grabbed the next set of cards, examining my hands to come up with a new round of play. Are you ready to lose? I declared arrogantly as I raised my cards against my face, curious how much information I could make them spill before their captain returned. The guards had dismissive smiles on their faces as they looked at my game, not bothering to hide their mocking smirks as I acted like I was putting my full attention on the game. I had all the confidence of winning the first pile, and not because I bothered to put a complicated strategy in place, or actually tried to cheat. No card shark would ever actually let the mark lose during the first hand, not even the incompetent, amateur ones I was currently playing with. Still, I watched them, looking for signs of cheating, not because I cared particularly much about the borrowed money I had, but because I wanted to get a sense of how things had worked in this new world I found myself in. It was for the better if I could avoid shanking before I got too ambitious when gambling. I failed to get any sign of cheating before the first pile was concluded after I raised by another 10 denikas. "You're so lucky," one of them laughed as slapped his thigh. "Look at that, almost 40 denikas, a great win." It would have been, if 25 of them hadn't already belonged to me in the first place, but my smile suggested that I was not aware of that fact. "Winning is fun," I said cheerfully. A few more hands, and 15 minutes later, the amount of money I had started to fluctuate, rising up to 150 before dropping down to 25. Currently, I was around 60, giving all the signs of a gambler taking that loss personally, willing to do everything to recover it, with several smirks targeting me in the process. However, even as I put on a show, most of my attention was still on observing them. The first thing I noticed, none of them actually used that mental weight on me to trigger bad decisions on me. It might be that they were preferring not to use it, but based on Falales and their commander's ubiquitous usage, I doubted that they were holding themselves back. Much more likely, lacked the ability altogether. Then, one of them glanced around before pulling out a flask from inside his armor, much to the angry glares of the others. "Commander might be here any moment now," one said. "Come on, he won't be. He has to go through everything upstairs to make sure everything is working well with the enchantments." "More than enough time for the smell to go away," he answered as he opened the flask. The sharpest smell of alcohol I ever had the displeasure of drinking hit my nose, hard. The soldier chuckled. Someone already received his perception. I shrugged, not commenting on his assumption as he took a large swig before he passed the flask to the one next to him, then next. Until it reached me. "Come on, great hero, try it," said the one who passed the flask to me, the mischievous nature of the suggestion obvious. "I'm not really good with alcohol," I started, only to be interrupted. "Come on, don't say that the great hero can't handle a bit of alcohol," another interrupted, his tone even meaner. I looked confused for a moment, before hesitantly reaching the bottle and making a show of taking a big swig, and a burning sensation filled my mouth, with a taste sharper than even the most inept moonshine I had ever tasted. I pulled it away, glad that I was already planning to make a show of how little I could handle my drink. They exploded in laughter. I can handle it," I said, giving a display of shame, and raised the flask again. Looking like I was consuming far more than I had actually done was a simple trick. "Here," I said as I passed the flask to the next one, and the game continued, giving me another thing to observe. Their signs of drunkenness, to assess how much the drink was impacting them, so that I could copy them. I need to look drunk, but not unbelievably so. Of course, I understand how to play it, I'm just going through an unlucky patch, I slurred as I looked at the 15 denikas that were in front of me, the dwindled remains of the money I had borrowed from their captain. "Of course you are, great hero," soldiers said. "You'll even learn how to handle your drink once you get a few more points of vitality." "Ah, stats, complicated business. They explained to me, but I'm having trouble remembering how they worked." "I'm guessing you didn't awaken intelligence," another commented, and the others collapsed in laughter as well. I waited a moment before joining their laughter, looking confused, acting like I was starting to get too drunk to understand I was the target of that joke. "How does the stats work?" I asked after they exhausted themselves. "I really need the refresher," I repeated, pushing on the reason I had been working so hard to put them into a good mood. They might have chosen not to answer if I just asked it directly. Drunk, and in a good mood after the long game, they were very careless about their words. Enough to slip all kinds of potentially sensitive information. "Well, stats are the best way of showing your true potential," one soldier started before getting interrupted. "No, moron, true potential is about your skills and class, stats just show your raw power," corrected another. "Semantics," he waved that off. "Either way, there are many stats, but not all classes receive the same stats by default. Only vitality is awakened in everyone, without exception, and rest varies from class to class. So, each class has fixed stats?" I slurred as I played another hand, one that would give a quick victory. I didn't want to stop the game as their lips were getting loose. More or less, he answered. There are some treasures that could be acquired from dungeons to awaken them, but unless you're a noble, it's basically impossible to acquire them, he grumbled. Not like it matters. Unless you have a class that actually gives you free points to assign as you wish, what's the benefit of having those treasures? It's not like you'll be able to collect enough to be worthwhile, the other answered. Yeah, I heard that the more you use the treasures, the less effective they get, requiring dozens to get just 1 point, commented another, though his tone didn't show much confidence about the accuracy of that information. I paused, already happy with the information that was spilling out of them, though what a dungeon was, I had no idea, but decided to prod more. And what about other ways to awaken stats? Is there any way to do it without those treasures? I said, but timed that question with a radical move, with all the recklessness of a new player. Well, there are natural awakenings, but they might as well be useless. You need to work years to get familiar with the concept just to awaken just one stat, and still, it's useless without free points to assign, he murmured. Unless you dare to awaken charisma without noble blood, then, he continued, only to be interrupted by a crack as his friend elbowed him on the ribs, their armor creating that explosive sound. I kept my attention on the game as they held their breaths, watching me carefully, their tenseness showing that what they had just spilled was a dangerous piece of information. Sorry, did something happen? I said several seconds later, raising my gaze, pushing an even more exaggerated slurring to my words. I was focused on the game. Nothing important, another soldier said while the one responsible for the spill let out a relaxed sigh. Let's continue. We continued playing, but they were much more careful in talking about anything related to the classes. Charisma was clearly a topic to avoid, and, considering what I had been experiencing since I had been summoned, I was willing to bet that charisma was about that weird sense of pressure I had been subjected to repeatedly since my appearance. So, you were talking about classes and their stats? How does it work? I said, pulling the discussion in a safer direction. That depends. Serf classes only get a bit of vitality and nothing more, while worker classes usually get between 1 and 2, all pre-assigned. Warrior classes usually get 3, but there are exceptions, he explained. His relaxed tone, along with the lack of reaction from the others, showed that it was common knowledge. They were quick to spill that to further distract me from their earlier blunder. I wanted to ask about the skills, but before I could do so, one of the soldiers stiffened. The captain is coming back, he said. I didn't hear anything, which was not surprising. After everything, it was not a stretch to believe one of the soldiers had a supernatural hearing. Maybe I should call it a day, I said before they could even ask me to, as I pushed the 15 denikas I had managed to keep to the side. Why don't you pass it to your captain and say I'll pay the rest soon, I said, making a show of stumbling as I climbed the stairs hurriedly. Good idea, one of the soldiers said, clearly not really interested to explain why they were getting their great hero drunk while gambling. It also worked to my benefit, as those soldiers represented a treasure trove for me. I didn't want their captain to see just how loose their lips had gotten in the process. I retreated through the stairs to the main corridor, still occasionally stumbling in case the guard who had heard the approach of their captain could hear. My mind was already on how to best leverage the information. I returned to my room, even though it was tempting to spend the rest of the night in the library, hoping to find something, but after some consideration, I decided against it. I was afraid of the captain checking to make sure I was in my place. I just stopped to swipe a book from the library, to see if I could use that to my benefit. The temptation to go and poke around the room Taras and Falale were currently occupying was even higher. They were still sleeping with the door open, drunk, but I didn't want to risk it. Even with my limited vitality, the impact of the alcohol had long disappeared, and I didn't want to take the risk of one of them waking up to catch me skulking around. My harmless aura was my single greatest asset, and I didn't want to risk it for the moment. I wasn't afraid of them getting rid of me after all the effort they had spent much, but that didn't mean I was willing to show myself. Right now, they were confident that a blast of mental pressure was all they needed to earn my earnest cooperation, and the longer I could make them believe it was useful, the looser their control would be around me. I closed the door once I returned to my room, and put the book on my bedside table, into the drawer, outside of the view of someone, but actually hidden. No need to make it look like I was actually trying to keep it hidden. Then, the next question, my stats. According to what soldiers had said, awakening stat points were supposed to be a challenging affair, one that required years of dedicated effort. And, since none of the other soldiers looked inclined to disagree, I was willing to take that comment at face value. Yet, I was able to awaken several in one evening. There were two possibilities. 1. It might a feature of my class, hero. It was not impossible, and fit with other detail that they had slipped. Many other classes were gaining somewhere between 1 to 3 points with each level. Even assuming there were others they didn't mention that gained more, I guessed that 10 was already somewhere near the peak, if not the peak. Still, that stat disparity, along with the near exponential growth the experience requirements displayed, gave me a solid idea of why they had gone all that trouble to summon others from another world and brainwash them rather than just raising a few of their own. Maybe there were other reasons as well, but the potential it represented was a good start. The second case was about the life I had lived. The guard had mentioned years of training required to familiarize oneself with the stat. And it was hard to argue that my life had more than qualified for that, forcing me to explore my limits again and again as I fought to survive, from the streets to the top. Maybe it was what they meant by familiarization, or maybe it was just a combination of two factors. Either way, it still represented the greatest opportunity one faced. I wanted to awaken as many stats as I could find. And I had two targets for that, intelligence and charisma. For intelligence, I tried to read the indecipherable book again and again, did hundreds of mental calculations, and even tried to recite some of the stories I had memorized. Unfortunately, none of them gave me the line of writing that I was trying to attain. Still, there was a silver lining, I decided even as I leaned against my pillow once more, my eyes firmly shut. It confirmed that it was more about my life experiences than the class itself. I had never been particularly good when it came to math, languages, or anything else that people might treat as intelligence. I had what others called street smarts, which was more about paying attention, staying alert, and reading people than actually making calculations. A task for the future, I decided even as I shifted my mind toward the next possible target. Charisma. It was certainly a fascinating concept, one that was far more familiar with. Even back in my world, charisma was something fascinating, something almost mystical, with some of the greatest paragons and monsters of the world rumored to wield it. Of course, I had a different perception of it. I had befriended, commanded, and ruled over enough people to know that charisma was a tenacious concept of managing the perception of others, ensuring their reactions to the situation were instinctive and emotional rather than calm and rational. A concept that had roots in many different aspects: our biological disposition to form groups, growing up with the idea of following authority since our childhood. Even the mental shortcuts we used to make our decisions. What people termed as charisma, whether used by con men, seductresses, or genocidal leaders, targeted those concepts to bypass rational thoughts and create an emotional response, or even better, trigger automatic action. The suffocating mental wave that was radiating off them constantly as they threw out orders was not that, but just like that, the radical healing displayed by vitality and health points wasn't exactly how healing worked as well. Clearly, there was some mystical enhancement of the concept, enough to turn that implied force of interaction and command into something much more intense, almost a physical presence. In that light, I wasn't surprised the slightest when the soldier mentioned some vague consequences of awakening charisma without noble blood. A simple statement, yet surprisingly packed with a lot of information. First, and most importantly, it showed that soldiers were aware of the existence of the mental effect and, somewhat accepting of its effects and existence, which had several interesting implications about how the ruling aspects of the world worked, the kind that would require weeks and months to even have a preliminary accurate guess. Or, I could just wait and see once we arrived at our destination. The second implication was simpler. Charisma was restricted, just like access to weapons was limited back in my world. Of course, there was no one rule globally, with different countries having looser aspects to personal weapons, but no country actually allowed their citizens to possess tanks and fighter jets. The mention of the soldier about only nobles being allowed to attain charisma reminded me of that. Whether that restriction was actually applied efficiently and fairly, was a very different question. Even without knowing anything about the world, I would be willing to bet that an innumerable amount of organizations were actually flaunting that role. I could even go further and guess that those included not only some freelance con men but also some underground enterprises, rich merchants, and possibly many other upstanding citizens secretly or not so secretly generating such forces. Expecting people to ignore the potential for power and authority was optimistic at best. The third implication came from their sudden panic at the mention of charisma to me. Combined with the dismissive way he mentioned when relaxed, my best guess was that they were ordered never to mention charisma to me, understandable as they were clearly determined to brainwash me as we traveled toward our destination. I didn't need the potential boost from that elusive intelligence to deduct such brainwashing would work much better if I stayed unaware of the effect. The initial mishap that happened during the summoning already made that part more difficult than necessary, when they used the impact of the charisma to make me level up, but it was clearly an unexpected crisis they had to deal with due to my own volunteering. Even then, Falale clearly had no concerns about using charisma on me, expecting it to work perfectly. Maybe he would have been right without the mysterious assistance of resilience, but life didn't work based on hypothetical cases. Unfortunately, the theoretical breakdown of charisma didn't bring me any closer to attaining it. Even as I spent hours trying to awaken it, I failed. And I tried a lot, thinking about the notable events of my life, giving imaginary orders, whispering orders despite the risk of being heard, even striking some charismatic poses despite being aware of how ridiculous they looked, but every single one of them came blank. Maybe it required some kind of medium to interact. Resilience awakened when I was trying to resist death itself, and while I awakened strength and agility relatively easily, strength was still triggered by push-ups, while agility required some coin tricks. Maybe charisma required a target to be awakened as well. Finally, as I was lost in my considerations, I heard a knock on the door. I pulled myself out of the bed and stood up, ready to invite them inside. It was time to put up another show. It was Taras that was at the door. "I hope you had a good rest. We have a lot of things to do today," he said, with a sense of energy that could never be displayed by someone that was suffering from a hangover. I didn't ask anything as I stood up. While his words weren't followed by the exact kind of pressure that followed Falale's words, there was no harm in showing my enthusiasm to follow their orders. The more obedient I looked, the easier it would be to slip things through them. Also, Taras was still radiating a sense of aura that asked for respect and obedience, which was more constant than Falale's occasional flares, and being proactive in questioning him might make me suspicious about my ability to reject the impact of his charisma. It was better to be safe. "Wear something more comfortable," he said as he pointed at the wardrobe. "Anything in particular?" I asked. "Just some pants and a loose tunic, maybe some robust boots will do. We will move around a bit today," he said, then smirked. "I hope your old bones can handle it." "Don't worry, I'm feeling like 50 already after receiving that boost of vitality," I answered, giving him an enthusiastic smile as I moved toward the wardrobe. He closed the door, staying out while I looked for something practical. Soon, I found some, at least after discounting the blinding colors. A bright, sky blue pants with gold accents was bad enough, and the even brighter green pants didn't make things any easier. The best boots I was able to find were dark red, which would have looked halfway decent if it was paired with dark clothing, but clashed horribly when combined with the others. As if they were trying to make sure I would never blend into the crowd. "I'm ready," I called from a distance, and he opened the door. "Follow me," he said. I did, passing several rooms as I did so. The room they had been drinking in the last night was still open, but this time, there were a few servants putting things in order, but even they were moving with a shocking speed and grace, better than the best dancer back in my world. Some of the other doors were open, with servants going in and out still, but the library door was already closed. "Did you get a good night's sleep?" he asked as he walked, though his tone left no doubt that it was more of a habit than actual care. "It was relaxing, though a bit confusing," I muttered, but that was the extent I questioned my presence in the new world. I might have tried to sell the story of a pitiful old man, confused and distressed by the situation he found himself in, but since they didn't show any care about my comfort other than my immediate physical needs, they didn't care about my mental well-being at all, or they expected those mental blasts to solve everything. Either case, a show of feebleness didn't look like the correct strategy, and since I didn't have the luxury of experimenting, I abandoned that track. I followed him obediently, not making the slightest of sound as we got nearer to the stairs. This time, some signs of sunlight coming from the window, softer than I expected. The reason turned clear as I got closer, only to see nothing but a whiteness outside, telltale signs of a thick mist. Either the clouds were higher, or we were descending. I followed him to the stairs. And, to my surprise, we took a turn upstairs. Taras pulled some kind of glowing sigil from his pocket and pressed against the door, and it parted open. The door closed behind us with an ominous crack, but I didn't let it bother me. It wasn't like I had any way to actually resist if they wanted to do something to me. However, unlike what I had expected, the stairs didn't lead to another corridor, but a huge courtyard, a huge tower at each corner, each easily 100 meters, maybe taller, and I noticed a fifth one right at the center, though it was only half the height of the others. The surroundings were completely bare, enough to trigger a sense of vertigo even without factoring in the castle itself was floating in the air. Not that I thought there was any kind of danger. The mist swirled over the courtyard, only to change direction whenever they got too close, creating the illusion of a great dome blooming from the four towers. Probably another force field like the balcony. I wondered whether it was something cheap to create, or it was just another sign of waste, though if the second was true, it wouldn't be the only way the courtyard was being wasteful. Other than the 5 imposing towers, the courtyard didn't feel like it was a part of a flying military unit, but a lavish roof garden. The stone surface was interrupted by artificial gardens, each bed housing a huge, imposing tree, surrounded by bright flowers with complicated patterns. Toward the center, I could even see several pools, glowing softly under the sunlight, the occasional movement of the surface showing that they were not empty. Wasteful, though, maybe I shouldn't be surprised too much, as none of the rooms I had stumbled upon earlier gave any sign of being miserly in the first place. Maybe the flying castle was not the equivalent of an aircraft carrier, but a private yacht. Beautiful, I murmured loudly, hiding my true thoughts inside as I did my best to look fascinated by the view. Yes, it is, Taras chuckled. Too bad that we're not here to rest but work. We need to understand what you are good at before we arrive at the capital, and we don't have too much. I ignored the opportunity to dig him about the reason, and instead avoided his gaze. I'm not good at many things, I muttered, doing my best to look ashamed of that detail. Don't worry about that, for someone to be chosen as a hero, they are clearly destined for great things. I'm confident that we can discover your true potential, he answered. His words were delivered carelessly, but accompanied by a sense of radiance, telling me that I could truly achieve anything I want. Naturally, bouncing against the invisible barrier my resilience had created, showing that it was just another variant of the same trick. Still, I perked up, and pushed a passionate expression on my face. If you believe so. Don't worry, I'm an expert. I have trained many people, and I can help you to explore your true potential, he followed. Really? I said, trying to sound impressed, though I desperately hoped that he was bragging about his level of expertise. The worse he was, the easier I could dupe him. I was glad for my little gambling session with the soldiers, one that gave me a general understanding of how things worked in this new world. And while I wasn't digging a lot about skills and abilities, the brief mention of skill stones, and Philael talking about raising a beast for its abilities when I had been summoned for the first time, suggested that they were being acquired later. Whether those were the only available paths, or there was a method like awakening stats, was still a mystery. Still, combined with other information, it was just enough to give me a sense of direction when Taras led me toward the central tower. Particularly, to the large opening at the center, with several pieces of equipment already being spread. At the edge of the opening, another familiar face was waiting for us, but with his hands buried into his palms and his body shaking, he was giving me the more expected signs of a hangover. I was surprised by the level of his distress, especially with my own experience with vitality neutralizing the impact of alcohol. Taras showed some interest in his state as well, but for a different reason. Wake up, sleeping beauty, it's time to work, Taras shouted, far too loudly, and only after getting close to him. Philael groaned in pain. Shut your mouth, you moron. My head is killing me already. What was in that bottle? You're the one who claimed you can handle my special brew, don't blame me, he said, laughing loud enough to hurt my ears. From his pained moans, it was clear that affected Philael even worse. First, your pet, now our bet, the mission is not exactly shaping out well, is it? Their rivalry was welcome for me. The more they were distracted by each other, the easier I could slip something without arousing any suspicion, not to mention the opportunities like the night before. Philael groaned in pain again. Silence, he gasped as he grabbed a blade from his waist, and threw it. The motion was smooth and fast, but it was nothing compared to the flight of the dagger itself, fast enough to disappear from my view. But not for Taras, who didn't even stop laughing as he caught the dagger, the blade between his fingers. A good reminder for me that, no matter my experience, I was nothing against them in terms of the actual threat. Come on, we have work to do, or do you want to explain to them why we don't have a detailed report when we arrived at the capital, Taras said. Philael raised his head, his frustration showing. But I had a feeling that it was more about asking Philael to work while he was experiencing a hangover than anything else. Go and start lifting some rocks, ignore our discussion, and tell us if a notification arrives, Philael ordered, once again accompanied by that same weight, even more intense this time. I made a show of stiffening and started walking toward the smooth, polished rocks of various sizes. Oh, come on, it's a waste. Do you think an old man like him could awaken strength in the first place? Maybe, but either way, it'll give me a chance to sleep a bit more. Now, shut your mouth, my head is killing me, he said as he closed his eyes once more, making my job of tricking them considerably easier. As I stood up in front of the rocks, I had no intention of hiding my capabilities, especially since my physical limits didn't have anything particularly impressive. I was fit for a 60-year-old, and vitality increased my potential to a degree, but neither fact was unknown to them. I lifted rock after rock, until I settled on one that was about 80 pounds, struggling to lift it as I repeated, but the endurance given to me by vitality helped significantly to repeat the action. Occasionally, I glanced at them, but they were distracted by their own little argument, too far away from me to hear. Not that I needed to, as Taras' juvenile actions were rather obvious, while Phalael reacted with increasing hostility. Their lack of attention further confirmed that they didn't expect anything to happen. I was happy to play along with their assumption just in case, especially if I could undersell the effect. Now, start running, Phalael ordered, once again weighted with charisma, and I did so. Faster, push yourself, he added, and I did so, but other than quickened breathing, nothing happened. Exercise after exercise, and despite vitality, I started to get exhausted. They started to whisper occasionally as they looked at me. Unfortunately, this time, they had enough presence of mind not to talk whenever I got too close, or it was simply luck, deciding I had already caught enough of a break in this new world I had found myself in. I decided to act when they started to show signs of boredom. I decided to act. It was clear that if a stat awakened, it would impact their further decision-making. I was willing to believe that, with their laziness, they wouldn't have bothered to go through with the process if it wasn't really important. So, while doing some kind of obstacle running, I came to a stop. Some kind of writing appeared in my view. It says something about agility potential being awakened. What should I do? I asked. Excellent, think hard about accepting, shouted Phalael, once again supported by his charisma, showing. The sudden passion in his tone surprised me, making me think that I had misread him, until I noticed Taras grumbling as he passed a pouch to him. Like the situation wasn't humiliating enough. A good progress, Phalael said as he stood up, though his face was still pasty enough to show he wasn't completely over his hangover. Agility is a good building block for a lot of fighting styles, maybe we could still make a warrior out of you, he explained. Oh, like a knight. I gasped in fascination. No chance in Abyss, not with your vitality potential, Taras said. I'm almost sure that you have some kind of hidden ability that reduces the potency of your vitality. It will be a waste to make you a frontline fighter. A ranged weapon would fit you very well, something like an archer maybe. But, I never shot a bow before, I said, then paused, lowering my voice even more. Though, I didn't use a sword either. Don't worry about that, Taras said with a laugh, his grumbling about losing the bet already gone. As a hero, you'll have your selection from the most amazing skills. Now that we have a good idea about what you are good on, we should move on to the next stage. Then, he turned to Phalael. What do you think? Do you think leveling up a bit before arriving is a good idea? Might be, Phalael said, noncommittal despite his mood, which improved significantly after his victory, and from the intensity of his reaction, I was almost sure that the pouch wasn't filled with silver but something much considerably more valuable. Still, we have to go through the other tests, just in case. We have already finished them all, Taras said. Not the mental ones, Phalael answered. Boring. And do you think he? Maybe. And boring or not, we need to be complete, Phalael said. Or why would I bother to actually try and deal with such things? Taras grumbled and walked away, while Phalael turned to me. Do you know numbers? How to add and subtract? Yes, I said. Good, tell me, what's 15 and 22, he said. I paused for a moment, surprised that he was asking me a question that wouldn't stumble even a primary school child. But as I looked at him, he only waited patiently, like it was normal for me to wait for that long to answer that question. It never hurt to underestimate, so I answered him. T37, I muttered, but only after a break. Is this the best you can do? He said with a dismissive sigh. What kind of horrible world have you come from? A very horrible one, I answered, despite knowing it wasn't a question. Clearly, he said, and asked me several more questions, slightly harder, but not particularly so. I wondered if it was more about the world I found myself in, or the dismissive way he was seeing my home. The soldiers had shown no problem with math while gambling, but I wasn't sure whether they were a casual example of the world I had been summoned to. Maybe they were equivalent to college graduates. Maybe he treated my world as a primitive place. It wouldn't surprise me too much, considering they didn't ask a question. After a long math test, one that I failed by failing to add anything in 3 digits, he moved other things. He had shown several pictures, asking me about details of them after giving me a temporary glimpse. It was an obvious test of perception, a stat I had awakened while they were busy with the after effect of their drinking game. I didn't tell them I had already awakened it. I might have acted differently if they were showing any kind of stress, but clearly awakening even one stat was above their expectations. Why bother to give them more if they were satisfied with what they already had? Nothing else, I said, and Falail folded another picture. Sorry? He didn't even bother responding to my apology. It was a fake one, of course, but still, rude. He moved to another test, this time giving me a deck of cards, a fancier version of what he had given me earlier. Try to memorize them. Once again, I gave a middling performance, while he didn't stay engaged. I still tried to remember the full set, even applying some tricks I had used. To my surprise, a line of writing appeared in my view. Stat potential awakened, memory. Accept/reject. I quietly accepted it, not giving any sign of irregularity. Interestingly, he didn't react to it, just like their lack of reaction when I faked receiving agility, a great difference from their panic when I leveled up. With their great display, it seemed like it would stay a secret. Hopefully. It looks like nothing else will awaken, Falail said after some more tests, unaware that he had given me another tool. Whether it would actually prove useful was a different question, but it was always better to have and not to need than the opposite. Go and tell the servants to bring the cages, he said. Why don't you go? I'm not your servant, Taras answered, even more bored than Falail. He was clearly a man of action. And while you're gone I can give him a quick lesson on archery. What's the point of teaching him anything before he gets a skill, moron? Find a better excuse. It's acceptable if you want to stay until I finish my tests, Falail answered, which turned out to be enough to trigger his movement only after a frustrated grumble. Another detail of his relative simplicity. Falail grumbled as Taras walked away, and we continued practicing. By the way, do you have any idea why you were able to awaken agility? You don't seem to be particularly fast or skilled, he asked between tests. I felt like it was idle chatter to pass time considering it wasn't accompanied by that mental pressure to make me tell the truth. That didn't mean I wouldn't act safe, of course. A quick examination of possibilities later, I answered. Juggling, probably, I said. Juggling? He said, sounding slightly confused. I reached to grab 4 stones from one of the tests he used to test my mental abilities, by making me play a game similar to checkers and started throwing them up. I was rusty when it came to juggling, but still, I was able to give a quick show. Enough to be convincing, if the boredom he displayed rather than suspicion was any indicator. Enough, let's continue, he said, this time showing me a different kind of test, which lasted about another half an hour, until Taras returned, along with a large group of servants, each carrying a medium-sized cage, each with monsters inside. Good, we can stop, Falail called. We have tested enough. It's time to level up, and show you the benefits of stats. Then, he paused, and gave an order, one that came with a strong sense of pressure. Don't forget, don't assign any points, or accept anything without checking with me, he said. Even as he gave that order, another suffocating wave accompanied his words, and a made show of trembling. Why yes, I stammered, but my attention was focused on trying to get more familiar with the sense of pressure, hoping to replicate it one day. I was entirely unsurprised that none of their attempts looked remotely fitting to actually awaken charisma. I said nothing as the servants walked in, carrying cages filled with animals. Animals that I had never seen before. Some looked familiar, rabbits and squirrels if such beasts ever grow enough to match the size of a dog, and grew spikes that looked intimidating enough to make them a part of a horror movie, while others looked completely unfamiliar. A 10-legged creature, as woolly as a sheep, bright green. I would have certainly remembered if such a beast actually existed back in my world. The beasts were angry, unnaturally so. They slammed against their cages with a repetitive fury, with an intimidating rabidness, but neither my handlers nor the servants reacted to their anger. It must be expected. I didn't say anything, the guise of obedience was a good excuse for me to stay back and observe as the servants placed the cages on the ground and left. As they did, Taras walked to Falail, and flashed some kind of orb. Look what I just found, he said. They were too far away from me to hear, but at this point, I was getting familiar with the way the lips moved. Enough to allow me to read their lips, another underrated skill of mine. What's that? Archery? Falale asked. Yes, and with a significant purity. Do you think it is worth the risk? Why not? He's clearly not the mage type. With his hampered vitality and his naturally awakened agility, it's the only natural direction. And it'll be good to have him with some skill. It might help during the auction. Good, Taras said with a smile as he walked toward the central tower, and opened the door, using the same rock he had used to open the main door. When he left, he was holding a short spear, one that I hadn't seen where he had pulled from, but I was certain he wasn't carrying with it before. I kept my attention on the cages, giving no sign of I had been listening to their discussion, but the word auction didn't fill me with confidence about my ultimate fate. At all. Have ever killed before? Taras asked, unaware their earlier discussion had been heard by me. Well, I said as I looked at the beasts, trying to decide which answer was the safest. Ultimately, I settled on one of the safer options that would allow me to act safely. I have worked as a butcher for a while, but the beasts weren't as angry. Good, then go and kill every single beast in the cages. I looked at the beasts, and gulped rather visibly to tell them I was intimidated by the beasts, even when they were in cages. Go and kill them, Falale ordered, once again with charisma, even more, impatient after spending a considerable portion of his day, trying to awaken my stats. Yes, sir, I said as I grabbed the spear. The moment I touched it, some kind of energy, like electricity, touched me, giving me a thumping feeling. It was not an ordinary weapon. I stood in front of the first cage, which held a large, blue rabbit creature, though his scary teeth gave no sense of cuteness, nor the rabid attitude it displayed as it smashed against the cage repeatedly. I pushed my arm forward, ready to feel a sense of resistance. Plus 138 experience. Only for the spear to sink into the creature, as smooth as butter, the magic of its nature making it much more effective. I ignored the ability it displayed, and instead started killing them one by one, though, even with it, I made sure to give a clumsy display of my activities. Plus 146 experience. Plus 31 experience. The notifications flooded my vision, and I understood why they had gone through such trouble to gather enough beasts to be counted in the dozens. None of the beasts I had killed granted me experience that was remotely near to what was granted by the first beast that I had killed. Quantity had a quality of its own, however. After finishing with them, I found myself with enough experience to level up, probably more than once. Experience, 6,790. How much experience do you have? Falale asked. Just above 4,000, I answered, another little test, to see if they had any concrete idea about how much experience I would gain. I deliberately kept it vague, and I could always tell that it was something near 5,000, and I rounded poorly. A bit on the lower side, but still, barely enough to level up twice, he said with a frown, but since his gaze was aimed at the beast carcasses that were still in the cages rather than me, I guessed that they didn't know what any beast would be granting in experience, but they still had a general idea. Another little advantage, if I could leverage it appropriately. Should I level up? I asked. Yeah, do it, Falale answered, once again in the form of a magical order. And assign all of your stat points to agility. Now, to another experiment, one that was considerably riskier than the previous ones I had been dealing with, but still not deadly. If they noticed, I could always blame my own limited mathematical abilities. The earlier display must have been sufficiently convincing. I tried to level up 3 times. Of course, I didn't even know if that would actually work, as I didn't know the experience needs of each level in the first place. I triggered the first and the second immediately, and a thick glow covered me. 1400 experience. Level up. Stat points plus 10. 2100 experience. Level up. Stat points plus 10. Again, I thought desperately, hoping that it would work to trigger another one before the glow disappeared. It did. Barely. 2800 experience. Level up. Stat points plus 10. Experience, 390. I waited for the glow to disappear as I looked at them, afraid. However, I noted that my minders weren't looking at me, but outside. The defensive wards glowed hard, a great number of flying beasts hitting against the defensive scheme. Their timing was too perfect not to be about my leveling up. Another interesting detail about the world I had found myself in, but for a moment, I focused on their reaction, afraid one of them would call off about my leveling up. They didn't, but with the intensity of the glow as I leveled up thrice, I felt that it might be more about their inattentiveness than the impossibility. The glow itself should be enough evidence. Either way, I moved on to the next little test, to see just how much I could slip through their limited attention. Stat points -12. Plus 12 agility. I assigned agility 8 less than they expected, keeping the rest in reserve. I was tempted to assign them to resilience, to make sure no one could actually affect me, but after some consideration, I decided against it. The sense of security it would grant was comforting, but under the circumstances I was facing, absolute security was not a luxury I could afford to chase blindly, even for my mind and thoughts. And, I could always add a few more stat points to agility if my display stayed underwhelming. A soft sensation spread in my body, but the intensity was much less significant than the spread of vitality, without filling my body with a great sensation. I didn't feel any notable difference in my body, but I didn't make any move either, watching their steady approach. "Have you assigned all of your points?" he asked, and I nodded. "All to agility?" he asked. I nodded again. Only for a sense of alarm to fill me as I noticed his arm tensing. It was the only sign of movement I had before his hand lashed forward, with a speed that was impossible to react. Or, was supposed to be impossible to react, but my body disagreed, reacting it even faster than my thoughts. It wasn't that I was moving faster, but the responsiveness. There was one important thing about fighting that amateurs misunderstood, the deadliness of the delay that occurred between noticing something and reacting to it, only a fraction of a second, but far longer than what a punch required to close in the distance. Especially, a supernaturally fast punch. Yet, somehow, I managed to react to it far faster than I could otherwise achieve, twisting my body to pull away from the punch, still unsuccessfully, pain blooming on my ribs as the punch connected, throwing me back. I prepared myself to roll as I flew back, feeling less like being punched, and more like a full-body tackle. My shoulder connected with the ground, and I let my body roll with momentum rather than trying to stop it forcibly. But it was also a surprise when, after the roll, I ended up on my feet, far smoother than I should be able to achieve, even back in my youth, tense yet perfectly balanced, ready to lash out. "Heal yourself," Falail ordered, though I didn't need his order to do so, once again triggering my health, and the warmth filling my chest, fixing my bruised ribs. -4 health. "Very good," Taras laughed as he looked at me, not following the attack. As I said, there's a reason for him to awaken agility on his own. "Yeah, not bad," Falail said. "Too bad he doesn't have the vitality effectiveness to be a warrior. An archer that can move around without a problem is also valuable. Maybe costlier, with all those special arrows he would need, but still valuable. Our trip is not for waste." I smiled, acting like I wasn't aware they were treating me like merchandise to be sold. I had my own little thing to celebrate. 18 points of stats, exactly the thing I needed to create myself an edge. But, before I could make any plans, Taras threw that glowing rock at me. "Here's your reward," he said with a chuckle. Skill spark detected, archery. Absorb/ignore. With nothing I could do to reject, well, not without ruining everything I had worked hard to set up, I chose to absorb. The stone turned into some kind of light, and filled my body. Along with it, a horrible headache. The most painful headache that I had ever felt hit me, enough to push me to my knees, making me feel like my brain was being scrambled. Yet, even as I did so, I could feel that it wasn't as bad as it could have been. The familiar feeling of resilience helped me to blunt the impact. Since it was resilience that was keeping me conscious, I decided to fake unconsciousness once more, even when I felt Taras grabbing and lifting me with one hand, dragging me like I weighed nothing. "What a weakling," Taras said even as he dragged me away. Falail chuckled. "What do you expect? It's his first time absorbing a skill, and he doesn't have any stat to actually help him absorb the information faster. With a skill stone with that high purity, it'll be shocking if he could wake up before we could arrive at the capital." "What about the indoctrination, then?" Taras asked. "Won't they be angry if he's not willing to do his mission?" "Don't worry, a man that old, but nothing to show for it," Falail said. "The paintings are more than enough," he answered. "Lazy as always," Taras answered with a chuckle. "What would you do if he acts out?" "Not my problem." "What do you expect? Summoning is always a thankless task. What kind of reward we will get, a pittance for a successful summoning, and maybe a bonus. Compare it to what the royal family will make of the sacrifice once they are properly grown. Especially if one of the gods shows interest. Things would have been different if they allowed us to join the auction, but you should learn to control your greed, my friend," Taras answered, even as I suddenly felt flying, only to land on a soft surface. I was back in my bedroom. I heard the door close, and their discussion was cut short. It would be a lie to say I was surprised at their words. Their intention to treat me as merchandise was very clear, though some of the words they had used, like a sacrifice, or gods, were hardly calming. Nothing that would be too problematic, I decided. I just needed an opportunity. However, before doing something else, I needed to get rid of the horrible headache that was still plaguing me. Resilience helped, but only for me to stay conscious. I could still feel foreign thoughts and sensations filling my mind, trying to make their mark. I had no hope of moving around secretly with that burning in my mind. It was time to use Falail's unintentional recommendation. Stat points -1. +1 memory. The moment I assigned the stat, I could feel the change. The headache weakened, and the foreign sensations and memories got clearer. The process continued, but the pain, while lesser, was still enough to prevent me from moving. Stat points -2. +2 memory. 2 more, and the pain lessened, enough for me to stand up and walk around. Not that I had done it, more focused on understanding the changes in my mind, the process of absorbing several times faster. I wondered if it was something truly important, I thought as I continued to shiver in my bed, ignoring the temptation to assign more points to memory and quicken the process even more. The process was unpleasant, but the not worst torture I ever felt. And, it wasn't like I could walk around before the night arrived. However, that didn't mean I had nothing to do. Stat points -1. +1 perception. As I increased my perception, my surroundings changed, as I had just put on a pair of glasses. The edges of the objects turned sharper, the shadows got less intense, and the movements clearer. A similar change happened to my other senses as well. My hearing got clearer, my touch more sensitive. Exactly what I needed as I sneaked around. Stat points -9. +9 perception. I assigned them as a burst, the sudden enhancement of sensation enough to intensify my headache even more. I lay down, the increased sensation enough to temporarily block the magical headache. I shivered with the soft caress of the comfortable bed, my fingers flexing to get the unfamiliar sensation, making me tremble helplessly. The faint odors in the room got clearer, though luckily, they didn't turn unpleasant. As I lay, helpless, a light coat of sweat glistened on my skin, like it was my only opportunity to take a breath. It was hours later, when a line of writing appeared in my vision. Archery of destruction, absorbed. The headache disappeared immediately, like it never existed, leaving me with my enhanced senses. A weird sensation, I murmured as I stood up, walking back and forth. Amusingly, only with my increased perception, I realized just how beneficial my agility was. Even as I moved silently, I made almost no sound, a lifetime of habits enhanced further by my abilities. How to use archery, I thought even as I mimicked holding a bow, but it didn't work. After being absorbed, the skill was locked in a part of my brain, but I failed to trigger the sensation. Also, I had no idea about the difference in name. The skill stone was just named archery when they asked me to absorb it, but now that it was complete, it was read differently. Not that I spent too much time on the skill. It was interesting, but I had more urgent things to complete. The first thing, strength. Stat points -1. +1 strength. Unlike the other stats, the moment I had triggered strength, I felt a sense of warmth spread onto my body, though, interestingly, the sensation felt more intense for my arms. Another set of push-ups allowed me to understand the change, allowing me to display a strength that I would have had trouble with even when I was young. But this time, I turned my attention to the smooth walls of my room, and started climbing. It was a struggle to pull my body up, still, but the combination of agility and perception made it much easier. Perception to allow finding the best places to grip, agility to maintain my balance as I did so. The perfect skill for a thief. Or an assassin. Stat points -2. +2 strength. I added increased strength, until I could comfortably pull myself with just one arm, which was all I needed to maintain my speed as I climbed. Still, I planned to stay in the room for another hour, until it was well past midnight. Hoping that it would be enough. However, before I could truly start to move, I heard the sound of a cry. Betrayer, the sound gasped, but that was all I was able to hear before it was cut off by a shocked cry. It was Falail. Just like you said before, my friend. Why work only for a pittance when we could make enough money to last us for a long time? Not to mention, I could serve a true power. It was wholly unsurprising to see that voice belonged to Taras. I didn't wait to hear the direction of the footsteps before I had moved to my bed, lying down to fake unconsciousness. I was not under any illusion that I could fight against Taras, or even get away from him. I still remembered the impact of his casual punch. Back to faking unconsciousness, betting that Taras wouldn't hurt me. Not because I trusted his consciousness, but because I trusted his greed. The door didn't open immediately. Instead, I lay down, ignoring the sound of combat. "What are you doing, Commander?" I heard the captain shouting, only to stop with a whooshing sound. "Retreat," called another sound, one that belonged to a soldier, followed by a few steps that were interrupted by another death cry. I did nothing other than give the impression of a pained sleep when my door opened, the footsteps coming closer. I felt a familiar hand grabbing me. He put me on his shoulder as he moved. He wasn't particularly fast, suggesting that he was confident there was no other immediate threat waiting for him after dealing with Falale and the soldiers. A little merciless trade. The way he positioned me, I was able to open my eyes without him noticing. It didn't take long for me to find what I was looking for. The pouch on his waist, one that he pulled the sigil to open the door. The only hope for me to create an opportunity to escape. My trust in him was limited to him not killing me immediately. Not the greatest hope for the future. As far as pickpocketing went, I was barely mediocre, but I had some advantages. He was still under the impression that I was still unconscious, and my supposedly painful twitching gave me an excuse to stay concealed. Agility enhanced my movement significantly as well, allowing me to hide a complicated finger dance as a spasm. Just like that, the small rock carrying the sigil was between my finger, grasped tightly, a little bet for the future. With the towers protecting the flying keep on the top, I guessed that he would be picking that. I kept my hand firmly closed, and my body loose even more as he changed his direction. "Just another minute, and I'll be safe," Taras murmured to himself even as he reached into his pouch. Only to curse horribly. I must have dropped it while fighting. "Just what I needed," he growled as he threw me down, and I let out a pained gasp, a natural response even while sleeping, yet kept my eyes closed. He walked back, not in a particular hurry to show he didn't feel any threat, leaving me thinking about what would be the next move. Taras walked away, leaving me with a critical decision. Which direction was better? The courtyard was a known quality. After spending almost a day there, I was very familiar with the layout of the courtyard, including many nooks I could use to hide. Unfortunately, while it allowed me to hide, it also boxed me in a location I couldn't retreat. And that didn't even consider the most important question. Why was Taras trying to bring me there? Maybe he had a path to escape there, some kind of vehicle that I risk using, or maybe he had allies coming from the sky. In comparison, downstairs was a complete unknown. The only thing I knew was the soldiers that had been defending the exit were sprawled across the corridor, defeated in a very permanent fashion. I decided to brace the unknown downstairs. Still, even with the decision made, I had to wait for Taras to reach their room. I focused on my senses, trying to listen. As I listened, I started hearing some kind of movement from the other side of the door. With the magical door muffling the sounds, I wasn't able to do much. I only knew that someone armored was on the other side, currently moving. And they were not close to the door, representing another source of danger, but also an opportunity, especially when combined with my obvious identity as an unconscious victim. I didn't know whether the people on the other side were allies or enemies of Taras. If they were his enemies, my little trick would work perfectly. But even if they were his allies, would Taras react to the disappearance of his prisoner, one that he was planning to exchange for a lot of money, nicely? Would a betrayer trust his allies when his payday had disappeared? I was more than willing to try. I waited until Taras disappeared at the end of the corridor to stand up, the sigil I had received from Taras in hand, and pressed against the magical keyhole. The moment the door started opening, I dashed down, trying to make as little sound as I could manage, only looking through the crack, enough to take a glimpse of what was going on. It wasn't long, but it was enough for me to notice the roof courtyard was not empty. I could already see one soldier, dressed in the exact same silver armor the other soldiers had been wearing. He stood in front of the main tower, pressing something against the entrance. It wasn't a sigil, but a bigger item, but if his stance was any indicator, it was clear that he had been there for a time, and behind him, I could see another flying vehicle, made of metal, hovering outside the magical dome, several more soldiers visible. I was sure he wasn't one of them I had been gambling the day before, but only through the process of elimination. I was glad that I didn't choose to go to the courtyard. Instead, I dashed down the stairs, doing my best to limit the sound of my footsteps. I hoped that unlocking the gate would give them the wrong idea of where I was going, especially with the slow pace at which the gate moved. Was that risky? Certainly, but otherwise, Taras would know exactly which direction I had escaped. I didn't think I could run faster than him, especially since I would be running through the unfamiliar ground. As I rushed down the stairs, the fastest I could manage without my footsteps exploding, glad that I was barefooted, I listened for Taras' footsteps, expecting him to react to the sound of the door opening with an explosive rush. Yet, when I heard his footsteps again, I was already at the bottom of the stairs, just a few feet away from the area where we had been gambling, a few pieces of silver still on the ground. I decided to waste a few precious seconds picking the two biggest pieces and putting them in my pockets, one on each side. I had no idea whether they would be useful, but having and not needing them was better than the alternative. Even then, I limited myself to only two. Having some kind of wealth was nice, but not when it would risk them clanging as I run forward. Only when I was at the end of the corridor, facing yet another locked gate, I paused. Should I open it, risking making a sound, or trust that I had managed to read Taras' mentality correctly, relying on instincts that I had developed while dealing with dregs of the society during my long life? A few seconds weren't too much to waste, I decided, especially if the worst came to worst, I could open the door but lay in front, continuing to fake my coma, letting them believe that whoever kidnapped me had chickened out, abandoning me. Then, I heard the explosive voice of Taras, loud as an elephant. What do you mean he's not here? Do you think I'm an idiot that you can cheat? Excellent, I thought, even as I tried to hear the response, but since they chose not to replicate wild animals, I failed to hear them. Nonsense, he was already fed a skill of the Lord of Destruction, do you think he can just shrug that off and go for a walk? And why is the door open? Taras shouted once more, followed by the sound of clashing metal. Success, I whispered in satisfaction as I used Taras' sigil to unlock the other door, taking a glimpse of what was on the other side. Another set of stairs, but this time, it was a more ordinary gray stone rather than high-quality marble decorated with precious stones and metals. Servants' quarters. Exactly what I needed. I triggered the door from the other side using the sigil once more, hoping that they were too distracted by their fight to notice the sound of the gate. Pity I didn't know how to lock it. Then, I dashed down, climbing down the connected seat of stairs. Soon I reached another corridor, one that was made of a dark, porous stone with no decoration. I rushed forward, aware that Taras wouldn't last long against his own allies, and that assumed they couldn't talk enough sense to him. Either way, I was on the clock. I rushed, expanding my newly enhanced senses to avoid the servants that were moving around. It was night, but many servants still moved around, wearing their smooth gray robes. Luckily, unlike the upstairs, the corridor was blocked with many crates and other items, creating enough barriers for me to stay concealed whenever a servant got too close. I didn't know if any of them had perception as a stat, but considering none of them actually reacted to the sound of fighting while the door was open, I guessed that it wasn't particularly intense. Even better, the corridor soon split into several, giving me a chance to take alternative paths, avoiding the areas with more intense servant activity. I bobbed and weaved as the servants darted about their tasks, running in and out of many rooms to carry their orders, haste filling their steps. Understandable, as it was hardly something that could be developed without too much chaos. However, I wasn't just moving forward and trying to stay unseen, but paying attention to what each servant was carrying. Some carried buckets of water, and others lugged around boxes filled with various items, their care showing their preciousness of them. I was searching for something simpler, a search that was completed when I noticed a servant moving around, a bundle of old, gray clothes bundled carelessly, treated like rags. Accurately, if the huge, ragged tear I could see on a dangling sleeve was any indicator. I could have followed the servant, but rather than that, I waited until the corridor was empty of others, and approached behind him, my breath mixing into my movement as my footsteps timed perfectly with his, using his own sound for concealment. A little trick to make assassinations much more effective. Yet, as I closed forward, there wasn't a blade in my hand. Instead, I just tripped him, my hand already lashing to grab the clothes of his hand, only to throw myself behind another pile before he could react. A simple chain of activities, yet only possible thanks to the abilities that were granted by my new stats, allowing me to move even faster than I had been able to do in my youth. "Are you cleaning the floor once again, Yuan?" came a voice before the servant could stand up. Another servant nearer to the end of the corridor. "Very funny," answered my unfortunate victim as he stood up, touching his wrist, the redness disappearing immediately. "Was that you? Are you blaming me for your clumsiness again?" The other servant answered, and they started bickering as they moved away. As I listened, I stayed behind the pile, rapidly changing out of the bright clothes of the hero, and into the dirty, gray robes of a servant. hoping that it'd be enough for me to walk around unnoticed. I waited until the servants disappeared to stand up, grabbing an empty crate to lift it to my face. A simple way to conceal, but effective. I walked forward confidently. It was one thing that most people misunderstood about disguise and infiltration, thinking that it required detailed makeup, carefully designed credentials, and weeks of observation. Was those useful? Certainly, especially when infiltrating high-value locations, carefully guarded. But walking through the corridors filled with servants, all I needed was to walk around with confidence and hurry, a loose excuse to walk around all I needed. I moved forward. Technically, the safest thing was to hide in one of the storage rooms, waiting to see if they would limit their search to upstairs, or if they would actually realize I was with servants. There, even if the worst happened, I would just change from one group to another and there was no guarantee they would be looking to harm me. Maybe they would even treat me as well as my original destination. Unfortunately, even thinking about that made my skin crawl. Earlier, I was happy to take a wait-and-see attitude, but now that I had a chance to act, trusting others for my future went everything I believed in. Luckily, perception allowed me an alternative. I walked forward, steady, following one of the most horrible smells I had ever had the displeasure of smelling. Yet, I smiled as I moved toward the direction as fast as I could manage without running. Running would be too suspicious. I passed several servants on the way, my speed much faster now that I didn't have to duck and cover whenever another servant was in the corridor. I wasn't careless, of course. My perception allowed me to track the footsteps with eerie accuracy, even before they stepped into the corridor. I quickened or slowed down as appropriately, making sure I constantly stayed away from them. Even with my disguise, it was for the best if I didn't get too close to any other servant. No need to take unnecessary risks. Until then I stood in front of my target, another magically locked door, the disgusting mixture of smell hitting my nose. The shape of the lock was different, but I still used Taras sigil, hoping it would unlock. It did, confirming that it was similar to some kind of universal access card than a specific key. Very useful. I wanted to smile as I stepped inside, and found myself in a room filled with cage after cage, both huge and small. Each was filled with a great number of beasts, growling and roaring. The biggest source of hope I had. Unfortunately, I wasn't alone. "What are you doing here?" said a servant as he turned toward me, standing up from the seat he had been occupying, loud enough to be heard through the loud beasts. "I'm here to take your place, captain's orders because I spilled his food," I said, trying to sound throaty, like someone had been squeezing my throat just moments ago. However, even as I did so, I pushed the door close with my foot. "Really?" he asked. "Are you questioning your orders?" I declared. I didn't shout, as unlike what most people assumed, shouting was never the best way to order people. It applied a sense of force toward the target, but any such force was only necessary without the expectations of being followed. He moved halfway before freezing. "Wait a minute, who are you to order me?" he realized as he took a note of my clothing. My face was still hidden behind the crate I had picked. I didn't get annoyed. Not when it triggered another line of notification. Stat potential awakened, charisma. Accept/reject. Stat points -1, +1 charisma. Not only I accepted it immediately, but also assigned a point to it rapidly. If it could be used like I had hoped, it would help me immensely. "Silence," I ordered, trying to reinforce my words with charisma. Unfortunately, that didn't work as well as I had hoped. I felt a flicker in my tone, but that was the best I could push to my tone. And that flicker backfired, shown by the widening of his eyes. "You're not a servant," he gasped as he rushed forward. "Maybe, are they really paying you enough to care? You can walk away," I suggested as I took a step back, lowering the crate. I didn't like senseless slaughter, especially when such young men threw their life away. Unfortunately, he didn't stop his charge. I hoped he would recognize me as the hero, and stop. He didn't. Luckily, he didn't also try to raise an alarm, maybe assuming that an unfamiliar old man would be easy to take down. A poor choice. If the situation was different, I might have tried to convince him to lay his weapon for a more extended time. But, after being treated as merchandise, very high valuable merchandise, but that didn't change its nature for the last couple of days, in a world where I still didn't know how it worked, and about to be hunted by another party with dubious intentions. I wasn't feeling particularly merciful, even if I didn't have anything particular against a servant that was only doing his job, maybe with more enthusiasm than it was necessary. I turned my attention to his charge, waiting for an opportunity, that came when he was 2 steps away from me, putting all his weight on one leg, ready to lash forward. The point he couldn't react. The empty crate in my hand made an excellent projectile weapon as it smashed against his chest. With the full might of my newly acquired strength behind, it smashed into pieces, filling his body with lacerations. Lacerations that were quick to disappear. A miracle in my old world, but after watching it happen several times in front of my eyes, even the most impressive miracle was quick to turn into something ordinary. I didn't even pause, closing the distance while he recovered from the improvised attack. I was tense, because I didn't know anything about his true combat capabilities. I knew that servant classes received limited stat points, but that was the extent of my information. I didn't know their average level, I didn't know their potential combat capabilities, and I didn't even know if they practiced combat regularly. Though, the smoothness of his slash to prevent my approach, with almost no leading movement, gave me the first idea. The tightening of his shoulder was subtle enough that I could have never noticed without perception, and without agility, I couldn't have changed my path to turn that dangerous swing into a close call. Even then, I stayed dangerously unbalanced. I prepared myself to receive a kick that would topple me back, putting enough distance to push forward, and prepared myself to roll with it maybe toward the wall that held several spears, hoping to use it to cover the distance. That was not the only thing he could do, of course, just the smartest option. I was still tense, ready for other, riskier moves, like shifting into a reverse grip to target a vital point, though I doubted. In a world with instant healing, the concept of a deadly hit would have been different. Was I ready to bet my well-being on such an assumption? Certainly not. I kept both feet on the ground, preparing to react to a dozen moves that might happen, glad that the combination of agility and perception actually allowed me to react fast enough to strategize in combat rather than reacting reflectively. Still, I found myself pausing as I saw his next move. He didn't follow up with a safe kick. Nor did he follow up with a more dangerous move. He pulled his dagger back, to the exact same stance he had used earlier, using the exact same slash. Surprised, I just took a step back, dodging. The attack was nonsensical enough to make me think of a trap, but there was no hint of it on his face. Then, he repeated the same move, the smooth perfection of the attack contrasting with the absurd strategic choice. I wanted to dodge again, to see if he would follow up the same way. But I didn't have the time to waste with such luxuries. Instead, as he swung once more, I ducked under the move and grabbed his wrist, slamming him down with a classical takedown. He was strong, but as I violently twisted his wrist to make him drop his dagger, I used my empty hand to grab the dagger before it fell to the ground. And, just like that, the leverage was entirely on my side. He froze, showing that he wasn't familiar enough with combat. Let's try it again. Stay silent, and I promise nothing, I started, giving him another chance to surrender. Not just because I was feeling merciful, but also didn't want to lose someone I could interrogate. He took a deep breath, preparing to shout even as he struggled, showing that he chose to resist the situation he found himself in. I lashed into action. I used my arm that was used to keep his arm to clamp on his mouth, silencing him, while the other lashed with the blade. My first target was his neck, against his artery, pulling back just as quick. Yet, the artery recovered almost instantly. That, I was prepared for. I stabbed him again and again, each stab recovering almost as quickly as they opened. Then, 15 hits later, they stopped recovering. His eyes widened, unable to process what had just happened, still trying to push me back. His diminishing strength was still impressive, but useless without proper leverage. Pity, I murmured as I stood up, throwing one last glance to his side before moving to the spear on the wall. He was far from the first person I had to kill. And, I strongly doubted he would be the last. I glanced at the door, and after a small consideration, dragged 2 of the smaller cages to the door before starting to work on the beasts. I didn't expect it to be useful for long, and even if it blocked for hours, there was little benefit to being locked in a room with no exit. I expected the barrier to last a few seconds at most. Not groundbreaking, but should be enough to give me some reaction time. Now, the weapon, I murmured as I glanced at the far side wall, with several spears affixed. Unlike the weapons that decorated the walls upstairs or the one that was given to me by Taras upstairs, to kill the caged beasts, the spears lacked the fancy decorations. I grabbed one, and realized the difference was not only the decoration. There was no magical sense of energy radiating from its surface, dancing under my fingers. No easy butchering for me, I realized. I walked to the weakest beast, from what I could ascertain from a glance, and stabbed. It tried to dodge, showing its rabid anger against people as none of them tried to hurt the other beasts, not even when they were piled in some of the bigger cages not intense enough to prevent them from dodging. Unfortunately for the beast, the cage was too small for it to escape. The stab was successful, but pushing took a considerable effort. Nothing like the earlier smoothness I had experienced with the clearly magical weapon. They don't like they care much about the servants, I murmured as I glanced at the other on the wall. More than 20, spread around like fire extinguishers, clearly there to be used if there was some kind of accident with the monsters. But I sincerely doubted they would have been useful, especially with the combat performance the unlucky servant who decided to make his last stand had displayed. The spears were only there to create a false sense of security. It didn't surprise me. It wasn't the first workplace safety violation I had seen with potentially catastrophic consequences. I wasn't standing lazily as my mind wandered. Even as my attention wandered, I was stabbing the beast repeatedly, and the wound recovered after each attempt. It took 20 stabs, most of it delivered to its vitals, to take him down. Plus 183 experience. An extended effort, one that would have taken everything I had if it wasn't for the unfair playing field of the cage. Life is not fair, little buddy, I murmured as I moved to the next beast, then next. Plus 95 experience. Plus 133 experience. Plus 46 experience. Beast after beast fell under my spear, allowing me to gather enough experience to level up in less than 2 minutes, at the cost of painfully burning arms and desperate breathing. Experience, 4,510. Experience that I was tempted to use leveling up. It didn't take a genius to realize just how easy the attempts would get if I assigned 10 more points to strength. But I didn't know their detection distance, and I had a fear that leveling up would alert them not only to my presence, but also the fact that I was rather more mobile than what they might be believing. Since they took this long to arrive at the servants' quarters, I imagined them going through every room carefully before moving down. That, or they took longer than I expected to finally kill Taras. With everyone having the ability to regenerate, along with all other abilities, I had no idea how the combat actually worked in this new world I found myself in. I could guess that it took longer than what I was used to, but how much longer? Still frowning as I waited for things to turn into a disaster, I continued killing the beasts, glad for their constant rabid anger. It made the death cries of the other beasts far less suspicious as I continued killing the beasts, occasionally discarding a spear as they broke down, proving weaker than my old bones. Magically enhanced old bones, maybe, but still old bones. Still, as I had passed the mark of 20,000 experience, I had barely managed to kill a fourth of all the beasts that were in the cages, but another spear broke in my hands, leaving only 4 more to be used. An interesting bottleneck to face, I thought, but I didn't stop killing. I could always start searching for more weapons once I finished with the task at hand. At least, that was my plan before it was interrupted by a loud shout. Gather around, a shout exploded at a distance, making me freeze as I felt a presence clashing against me, resilience once again creating a barrier. I recognized the voice. It was Taras, which was a surprise. After their fight had started, I was expecting the intruders to be the ones victorious. Maybe they had come to an agreement. Or maybe, Taras was the victor. I didn't know which one was the best case. Yet, Taras' continued survival wasn't the only reason I froze, not even the greatest reason. No, that honor went to the pressure that accompanied his shout. I had thought that Taras lacked Philael's ability to use the impact of charisma, but that shout proved it to be otherwise, maybe, if the thing he had been using was charisma in the first place. The difference was hard to describe, but whether it was Taras' subtler aura of inspiration, Philael's orders that demanded the truth and obedience, or the late captain's anemic display of pressure, charisma lacked flavor, for lack of a better term. Taras' shout was certainly not flavorless, and that was not an advantage. Not when the flavor in question was a disgusting mixture of blood, ashes, and fire. Or at least, the mental equivalence that left me trembling in a primal fear, the kind that I had never felt before. No, I corrected as a memory stirred forward. A fear that I felt only once, in that tunnel of light, when my gaze locked with the shadows that surrounded the tunnel of light. I wasn't the only one that reacted. Even through the insulation of the stables, I heard servants shouting back. Yes, my lord, they shouted, but I didn't enjoy the tinge in their tone. There was an angle of desperation in their tone. No, not desperation. Madness. Once again, I felt glad for the existence of resilience, allowing me to resist whatever magical effect that shout had. Then, I turned my attention to the beasts, beasts that stilled for a moment before exploding into action once more, their roars even louder, their smashing even more desperate. That was not the only difference. This time, none of the beasts paid any attention to me, every single one of them facing the direction of the shout. A mad gambit, I murmured as I looked at the beast, removing the barricade from the door even as I did so, glad that I had only pulled 3 cages in front of the door. Taras exploded into another cry. "Embrace the destruction, weakling," he shouted, though this time, it was even more of a beastly growl than actual human speech. I doubted that I could have understood his words without the assistance of perception. Even with that, it was a close call. "Yes, my lord," a servant shouted, one that was cut off by a desperate cry, one that filled with a weaker version of whatever Taras' cries had been radiating. The mention of destruction didn't make me feel better. The suffix of destruction that came attached to my archery skill felt considerably more ominous. "A problem for another time," I said as I continued working. I opened the door, but didn't step out. I might not have lived long in this new world, but I had to be an idiot not to realize that whatever going on was extraordinary. And not the good kind. "Let's see if I read you correctly," I murmured as I closed in the first cage. It was locked, but that was not a bother. I had already tested that the sigil worked to unlock the cages earlier, one with no surviving beast, naturally, and now, I targeted a cage with a solitary beast. Some kind of raging wolf. I braced myself as I unlocked the cage, my other hand gripping the dagger tightly, ready to defend myself if I had misread the reaction of the beasts. Yet, the wolf-like creature just dashed forward, completely ignoring my presence. "Excellent," I murmured as I went through cage after cage, unlocking them. I had no idea if Taras and the servants could handle all, or if it would end up in my death after they had been dealt with, but at this point, it was not something I could actually pay attention to. "Attack, kill them all, prove yourself worthy of destruction," Taras shouted, his voice making me shiver in fear once more. I didn't even want to imagine how I would have felt without resilience acting as a barrier. However, the deafening stampede of beasts was getting smaller much faster than I had expected, which was hardly a good sign. I dashed out of the room the moment I unlocked the largest cage, moving in the opposite direction of the stampede, hoping that I would be able to avoid Taras, though I didn't neglect to grab a spear on the way out. Just in case. I had no idea what was going on with him, but I had a feeling that faking unconsciousness wouldn't work. Advertisement. I was tempted to level up. I dashed in the opposite direction of the beast horde, only to take a sharp at the first opportunity, circling as much as the complicated corridors had allowed. Corridors that I could remember more sharply than I expected, considering most of my attention was focused on trying to track the smell of the stables and the location of the other servants rather than just the layout. Memory stat was proving its worth. I moved as fast as I could manage as I listened to the sounds of combat, which was showing signs of spreading, more and more servants letting out crazed cries, begging for various aspects of destruction for power and blood. It didn't make me feel any better about the sole skill I had in my possession. That destruction title was clearly not good news. I only spent a second feeling bad about it. Ultimately, I need to get away safely from whatever was going on, which was a challenge enough. Unfortunately, there was only one potential exit, and that path was blocked by a battle between beasts and crazy people. I completed as I saw a movement at the other end of a corridor. A servant, with a blade in his hand, swinging desperately, his expression showing an expression of rage and ecstasy, one that would have been enough to unsettle me even without the disgusting crimson glow in his eyes, making him look more like a monster than a man. Yet, that madness was not without its benefits, every swing of his leaving a lingering glow of similar nature on the beasts he was attacking. Something dangerous, considering that it took only a few wounds to take down the breasts that were making me struggle. That wasn't the only change. He was also faster than the other servant by a considerable margin, and if the ease he managed to shake off the beasts that managed to take a bite was any indicator, stronger as well. Either the servant I had fought against was a weakling, or the crimson transformation they were going through granted them those improvements, for a great cost. Interestingly, even with all the improvements, his fighting style was oddly similar to the previous servant. The swing itself was different, but the pattern of movement was the same. Complete the attack fully, pull back to the exact starting position, and deliver another full-powered, oddly perfect strike. Weird, but it gave me hope to pass him without leveling up. That was not to say leveling up again was not tempting. Tripling my strength to deliver deadlier hits was tempting, and so was increasing my agility to boost my reflexes. But neither temptation wasn't enough to rival the fear of triggering Taras' attention. I rushed forward, joining the beasts to attack the servant. The servant didn't react to my presence, not even registering me as a threat, while the beasts didn't try to attack me. I wasn't an expert on the spear, but after using it to murder hundreds of beasts, I managed to develop a basic competency. I waited a few seconds, waiting for an opportunity, which came in the form of one of the larger beasts, slamming against him just as he was starting to swing. I pushed the spear forward, pushing as hard as I could manage in his weapon-wielding arm, until the spear pushed through it and sank against the carcass of a beast behind him, pinning him in place. And I just rushed forward, leaving him to resist the rest of the beasts. I didn't try to kill him, because even against an ordinary servant, it took dozens of hits before I could take him down. I had no idea what was the limit of his new health, but with the ease with which he was shrugging the attacks of the beasts, it couldn't be too shabby. I didn't have the time to deal with them. Instead, bet on his crazed nature and ignored him, hoping that he would focus on the beasts, ignoring me. Though I didn't expect him to just pull his arm until he broke the spear, attacking the beasts once more. I rushed forward, ignoring the fight that was going on, staying away from the edge of the battle, and, somehow, managed to reach the stairs without coming across another group. I climbed the stairs desperately, once again pulling the sigil from my pocket, ready to unlock the door immediately, and considering whether it was worth the risk of trying to close it behind me if the door was already open. Especially if I heard anyone other than Taras following me. Luckily, no one did, I muttered as I paused at the top of the stairs, looking at the next floor. I didn't have the luxury of stopping, but sometimes, things were shocking enough to force bad decisions. The current state of the huge, magical, and previously imposing gate was one of those moments. Previously imposing. One of the wings had been pulled out of the hinges, and thrown against the floor, almost 50 feet away from the initial position. Either someone was putting on a show, or it was effortless for them. The other wing was in place, but with a large cave-in at the center, bending the metal, leaving behind the sparks of crimson that were still dancing, corroding the silver. And, at the center of that dent, there were 4 indentations that suspiciously looked like a punch. Not trying to face Taras was the correct decision. I rushed forward, ignoring the existential threat that came from yet another close call with death, a feeling that I had felt far too many times to be entirely healthy. However, whenever I saw an open bedroom door, I pushed in. The wardrobes were unfortunately locked, but I didn't let it bother me. I just grabbed all the blankets I could find, preparing for my next desperate trick. After making sure the bundle was sufficiently large, I continued running. However, a shiver hit me as I continued, as I realized that the corridor started to change. First, I noticed a red spot on the wall, one that I would have written off as an illusion if I hadn't seen something similar on the surface of the broken door. A flickering red spark. I hoped it was just another remain of Taras' reckless charge, a hope that died quickly as I moved, the number of red sparks only increasing. When I arrived at the stairs, half of the marble had already corroded into black stone with a rough surface, the red glow that surrounded not helping the impression any. What a shitty new world, I murmured as I started climbing, doing my best to avoid touching the red spots, hoping that my jumps would be enough for that. However, as more and more stairs turned completely untouchable, I faced a new problem. I would go down and search for shoes, a great oversight not to combine it with my search for blankets, but I didn't expect to climb demonic stairs or risk myself touching that red energy. Or, I would cheat. 3600 experience. Level up. Stat points plus 10. 10 stat points. Plus 10 strength. Was assigning all points to strength wasteful, certainly. But I didn't have the time to waste experimenting one by one, especially since, for some reason, the stat empowered my legs less than my arms. Instead, I jumped vertically, taking note of the improvement as it would have been ironic to fail due to my haste and touch the red energy. As I jumped, a cry exploded from downstairs. At this point, deafening mad cries coming from downstairs were not rare, but the accompanying pressure, one that was even thicker and stronger than Taras' initial rage, was certainly exceptional. A kind way to tell me to move. Yet, just as I jumped up, I found myself reaching the next stage. I triggered the leveling process once again, the glow surrounding me intensifying by a great margin. 4500 experience. Level up. Stat points plus 10. 5400 experience. Level up. Stat points plus 10. 6500 experience. Level up. Stat points plus 10. I didn't have the time or intention to repeat the process, as I was aware I had only a couple thousand experience points remaining, but during the last level up, the sensation was different. Like the path forward was blocked. Even as I jumped again, trying to understand the reason. It didn't take long. Level 10. Experience / With no indicator for current and future experience, it was clear that the system had hit its limit. Whether temporary or permanent, I had no idea, nor I wanted to actually test it. Instead, I continued jumping through the stairs, hoping that the corrosion that was going on would damage the invisible barrier that was keeping the balcony inaccessible as well. As I climbed up, I came across several body parts, ripped violently, likely signs of the battle I managed to trigger, but ended much differently than I expected. Hopefully the balcony would work, I found myself murmuring as I finally reached the next floor, the corridor that was connected both to my room and the room that I had been summoned. That red energy was coming from the courtyard, and it covered the next set of stairs completely, with no angle to be leveraged to climb further even if I put all the points I had just received into strength. The sound of the commotion was overwhelming as well, monster cries that put the little stampede I had created into shame, occasionally cutting short with huge thuds, hardly something that made me enthusiastic about testing it in the first place. I dashed, hoping that I wasn't about to lock myself into a dead end. When I arrived at the balcony, chaos greeted me, yet, I cared about two things above everything else. First, the barrier that was keeping the balcony protected, like invisible glass, was gone. I tested it easily by reaching with my fingers. Second, the state of the barrier was around the floating fortress. I had a long range of tests I wanted to attempt, to see if it was triggered by objects that moving from the inside, by throwing several things to test. If it was triggered, I would have been forced to climb the roof courtyard, to see if I could somehow figure out how to sabotage it before Taras caught up with me. Luckily, those weren't necessary. I could see that the barrier was gone, even without throwing any kind of object. The horde of flying beasts, some barely as big as chickens, others large enough to rival elephants, filling the skies, diving toward the upper courtyard without any impediment was enough to show that their numbers were enough to cover up the sky. Just not enough to hide the fact that the flying castle had changed its direction, climbing toward the sky rather than moving down, its speed far greater than what it had been displaying earlier, but I let that slide. I was occupied by the reason for the lack of beasts inside the fortress despite the great rush. An answer came in the form of huge black tentacles, wrapped in the same crimson energy I had seen on the servants. It was time to get away, I thought as I rapidly tied the blankets I had gathered. This time my hurry was not just about the risk of Taras' approach. I might not be familiar with the new world, but guessing those giant black tentacles, easily taking down birds bigger than elephants didn't take that much. The spread of the crimson energy was an even worse sign. The two towers previously displaying an elegant sense of beauty, had long corroded into a half-broken state, the crimson energy dancing over their structure even more intense. Whatever was happening was not good. I'm too old for this shit, I murmured, suddenly feeling more empty for one of my favorite movie characters, and jumped. It wasn't a suicide attempt, no matter how it would have looked the others. First, I was confident almost that even if I reached terminal velocity, the combination of a stronger body combined with health would have been enough to recover me. Second, I wasn't falling with the terminal velocity. No, I had my handmade parachute, tugging violently to my arms as I violently floated away, my grip a struggle to maintain even with the latest strength assignment, which was part of the reason why I took the risk of leveling, but I managed to resist the temptation to assign even more. I had no idea what kind of situation I would face as I floated away, into an unknown world, wearing nothing but rattled clothes, and armed with just a dagger. But maybe it doesn't have to be, I murmured as I noticed a welcome sight as I moved down. The flying vehicle the intruders had taken to arrive at the castle, unaware of the gruesome fate that awaited them, was floating below, still in the same place. An opportunity that was too great to miss, I thought even as I pulled the blanket, trying to direct my fall. There was a chance the controls were simple enough that I could figure. And even if the controls weren't as smooth, there might be something I could take to make what awaited me slightly easier. I still remembered the rabid, crazed reaction of the beasts toward me, and while that crimson energy posed a greater temptation toward them, I expected things would change once if I got away from the castle sufficiently quick. Agility and strength helped me to change my direction, even more accurately than I had been expecting it to be possible. And, for a moment, one happy, blissful moment, I thought that it would be it. Then, I heard a cry of rage, one that overcome even the constant cacophony of beasts' desperate battle against the tentacle monster. I glanced up, only to see Taras looking at me. Or, at least, what I had assumed as Taras, but the changes were enough to make that only a possibility rather than a certainty. The crimson glow enveloped him, just like it had enveloped everything else, but much thicker, almost enough to prevent me from seeing the change underneath. I wished it was completely effective, as whatever transformation was going on was the stuff of dreams. Most of his skin had already melted, replaced by some kind of scaly stuff, interrupted by occasional small tentacles that reminded me what was going on the floor above him. But, that was the extent I could pay attention to his looks, because he raised his hand. For a solitary second, I hoped that it was just a show of anger, but once again, hope didn't survive for long. A blast exploded from his hand, targeting me accurately, aiming perfectly for my direct path. Which was not too easy, considering both of us were moving on different vehicles, and the blast was slow enough to require some compensation, but the aim was accurate. Eerily so for a man who was, for all intents and purposes, turning into some kind of rage monster. I reacted the best I could, stopped grabbing one end of the blanket, and plunged down immediately, the wind exploding around my ears. Not the best strategy, but if it could bring me outside his range, I was willing to take the risk of directly plunging into the ground. Unfortunately, that was another hope that died quickly. Another blast of that crimson energy targeted me a few seconds later, forcing me to push through my limits to grab and pull the blanket, struggling to turn it into a parachute once more. I dodged again. Or, I thought so. This time, just as the red energy was about to pass a few feet away, it curved, targeting my midsection. I tried to pull my body to avoid it, but I was only partially successful, receiving a glancing hit. The hit itself wasn't much, just a glancing hit that I could have written off easily if it was a gunshot or something similar, but it exploded with intense pain, the likes I had never felt before. Enough to trigger shock if it wasn't for the existence of resilience, the mental sense of distance once again dominant. -8 health. I triggered the recovery energies, and the pain disappeared, for a moment. Even as the wound it created healed, the crimson energy stuck in my body, diminished, but was ready to burn again. Only another blast of health extinguished it. -41 health. Costing me half of my reserves, and just for a glancing wound, when a few points were enough to heal several deadly bullet wounds. And, since I still had no idea about the range Taras had, I had only one gambit. Desperately, I directed myself toward the floating carriage, aiming at its open door, which was close enough that I hoped to avoid the chaos. As I flew, I focused on my mental space, to see how much health I had. I hadn't lost count, but I needed the comfort of knowing I could handle at least another glancing at it. Health, 47 out of 100. Archery of Destruction, 2/X. Instead of the comfort I had been searching for, I found myself facing an unwelcome sensation. The skill appearing without my explicit aim, with its title carrying destruction, was not good news, and the sudden change I could read was even worse news. Maybe it wasn't health that allowed me to get rid of that red energy. Another thing to ignore, I muttered as I continued directing myself toward the flying carriage, my best hope of escaping. Even if I failed to use it, it would still give me cover. My hands tied around the flight, I had tried to do the most complicated maneuver of my life, aiming at the open door of the flying vehicle. My speed was dangerously fast, but that danger wasn't as scary as the crimson energy gathering in Taras' hand. I burst through the open door at full speed, with no chance to bleed any momentum, pain hitting me hard as I collided against some kind of device at the center of the room, and several growing orbs spread around the room. An injury that would have killed me easily, or at least left me crippled back in my own world. -9 health. Pity, I didn't have the luxury of enjoying the relative invincibility, especially since I was just a few years away from the period where a slip in the shower might prove deadly. I immediately realized that, in my emergency landing, I managed to destroy a vital aspect of the flying vehicle. The glowing rocks were a small piece of evidence. So was the sudden plunge the device took toward the ground, like its strings were cut. However, that was not the biggest source of my focus, as I certainly enjoyed the existence of a cover that traveled with me as I moved toward the ground. No, that honor went to another set of writing appearing in my field of vision, begging for my attention. Energy source detected, promotion available. Trigger promotion. Accept/decline. I was tempted to accept it, as the system was the sole reason I was able to survive, and promotion was something that was worthy of testing. Unfortunately, I had no idea whether it would be instantaneous, and it was something that could await my landing. I tried to stand up, but before I could do so, I felt a flare in the distance, coming from the flying castle. It was a flare of crimson energy, similar to how Taras radiated when he was ordering around the servants. And, an order echoed in my mind. Except, I had no intention of following such an order, and tried to reject it, but I felt a flare in my mind, my soul skill giving the same sense of redness, almost like a Trojan horse. My mind filled with a desire to kill, to slaughter, to destroy. Except, I desperately tried to assign all of my free points to resilience, that it would be enough to protect me from those commands. It wasn't. Before I could even assign any of my free points, I lost my ability to resist, forced into the mental command, accepting the promotion. The moment I was forced to accept the promotion, a sense of pulling appeared, emanating from me. The blue stones that were floating around me were impacted by that change immediately. Glowing strings appeared on them, and connected with me, far faster than I could even attempt to dodge, but even as the glow started to flow into my body, there was no sense of damage. I tried to stand up, but my body didn't listen to me. That was not the only energy that flowed to me. A second later, another bolt of red energy slammed against the top side of the vehicle, but rather than starting to corrode the metal as I had expected, it turned into a red mist, one that flooded toward me. It was slower than the blue strings of energy. But I failed to dodge it, lacking the ability to move in the first place. I prepared myself for a disaster, one that could be developed into an intense explosion of pain, one that might prove my end. The red energy entered my body obediently. Archery of Destruction, 3/X. Archery of Destruction, 4/X. Archery of Destruction, 5/X. I desperately tried to assign more points to resilience, hoping that it would give me the ability to reject the call, but I wasn't even able to send mental commands. The world lost its color. And I found myself floating in emptiness, with nothing around me, including my body. I was in a soul state, a dream, yet not a dream, still a sense of separation between me and the world, barely enough to make me remember what had just happened before. No matter how much the whispers filled my mind wanted to forget. I floated, the sense of time and space disappearing. I might have been there just an instant, or for years, with no real way of distinguishing which was the case. But soon, I realized that I wasn't alone. A glow surrounded me, a crimson glow, whispering to me to embrace it, embrace the truth, promising me wealth, power, freedom, immortality. Anything I wanted. I just needed to accept its touch. I would have laughed, if I actually had a mouth to show such a reaction. I might not be sure about where I was, what was going on, or even if it was a dream. But I had lived long enough to know that such lofty promises were never true. I had seen that many times, since I was a young man, trying to carve myself a place in the merciless world. Many friends, allies, or enemies had chosen to follow the promises of the others, believing them when they were promised riches and power, only to end up in an early grave. And, if believing an old mafia boss about unsubstantial promises was a poor idea, what did it say about listening to the promises of an eldritch being promising eternal life? I rejected his call, even when the energy drifted closer and closer, begging for me to touch, the voice getting louder and louder. However, I realized one thing. No matter how strong was the voice, there was no compulsion in that tone, forcing me to make a choice. Why that was important, I was having trouble remembering, but it was important. Somehow. I resolutely rejected its call, waiting. And waiting. And waiting. Soon, other whispers joined the first one, asking me not to choose the crimson light, that there was only destruction and danger in that direction. On that, I had no problem listening to those voices. The same didn't apply to their other words, asking me to choose them instead. With the number of whispers increasing, so did the promises. Some promised me justice, shining and fair, but I had lived on the edge of the law enough to know how much of a joke that idea of true justice was. It was only an excuse for the powerful to oppress the rest. Some promised me knowledge, limitless and true. Some promised me martial power. Some promised me eternal ecstasy. I rejected all, waiting, even as some kind of energy filled my soul, giving me a sense of potential, one that I failed to direct. I waited. And waited. Promotion complete. Alignment, unaligned. Reward, ability, elevated life, basic, human. It was the first thing I had seen once I found myself in my own body. A fascinating set of writing. Even more fascinating was a sense of power filling my body. It felt similar to what I had experienced while I had been assigning stats, but it was more comprehensive. I might have paid more attention to it, if it wasn't for another shake, reminding me where I was. Still in the same vehicle, still falling. Which confirmed one thing. Not much time had passed, at least in the real world. The ceiling was covered with that same crimson energy, corroding the metal, leaving only rust behind, giving me another reason to abandon it as soon as possible. Especially since a glance through the open door could confirm that I was not too far away from the ultimate destination. The ground. I glanced around rapidly, trying to see something that I could pick. I saw a discarded sword, and nothing more, and desperately grabbed its hilt, the tingling sensation showing it to be one of the magical weapons, before grabbing the blanket once more. And jumped out, hoping that I wouldn't be greeted by another crimson blast. That turned out not to be the case. I looked as I jumped, barely 500 feet away from the ground. I glanced up a moment, confirming the floating castle was far away enough not to target me once more, and it was about to disappear into the clouds before I focused on my landing. I focused on it, because I was experienced enough to know that 500 feet were already far below what was recommended for a safe landing, and that was with an actual parachute, and not just a few connected blankets, and I didn't have the luxury of paying attention to anything else. Health was there to reduce the damage, so even a bad landing might not kill me, but I was about to enter a wilderness, one that was very likely filled with monsters, and didn't have the luxury of wasting even one more health point than necessary. Especially before finding out how to replenish them. The food I had consumed during the feast did so, but maybe cooking required a special ability or process, another experiment for a future date. Instead, I tightened my grip on the blankets, desperately trying to control my direction as I tried to direct myself, bleeding as much momentum as possible even as I examined my landing spot. A thick forest, with no possible landing spot, but the number of branches gave me an opportunity as much as danger. I tried to direct myself toward the softest-looking tree with the most branches. Before landing, I wanted to increase my chances of a safe landing as much as possible. And, the best way to do that was to spend my unassigned stat points. I didn't want to replicate my mistake when I had jumped down from the fortress. Not to mention, with the promotion done, I felt the barrier to blocking my leveling was gone, making saving even less of a priority. 30 stat points. +5 strength. +5 agility. +5 perception. +5 vitality. +10 resilience. Technically, assigning some to resilience was not the smartest move, but the voice in mind, forcing me to accept the promotion was still clear. I didn't want to experience that again. The flight was already much easier after the improvement granted by elevated life ability, and the additions to other stats helped it to reach a point where I could call it almost comfortable. Strength helped me to grab the blankets much easier, and agility helped me to balance myself and direct, perception allowing me to see much more accurately than I ever thought it to be possible even in the darkness of the nighttime. Before I could reach the forest, an explosion happened nearby. I didn't need to turn to see that it was the flying vehicle hitting the ground, the flames already high enough to add a little brightness to the dark forest. Through the excessively crimson tone of that brightness was not good news, I assumed. I ignored that as I focused on my landing. I directed myself to the tallest tree, twisting my body near, kicking myself to bleed the momentum, the hit on the tree hard enough to leave a deep crack, before shifting the direction, repeating it again. Without dropping the dagger or the magical sword. On the third attempt, I twisted the blankets and turned them into a lasso, letting it wrap against a thick branch, moving still fast enough to crack it, but the damage was enough to slow me down. I loosened my grip on the blanket, and safely landed on the ground. I was safe, well, safe-ish. After the great escape, and that amazing landing that stretched the meaning of what was athletic and what was not, I wanted nothing more than to lie down and wait for my panicked breathing to calm down. But I didn't dare to do so, for several reasons. The forest fire that was currently starting was one of those reasons. The sound of forest creatures moving toward my location was another. A few creatures that passed near me were enough to confirm that, but I didn't know if the monsters would simply ignore me if the fire went out. Or, the fire could just continue spreading, which was hardly a reason to stay either. I started running. One that would have been counted as a desperate dash, barefooted, a weapon in each hand, but with my supernatural enhancements, it felt more like a comfortable dash. Almost as wondrous as my new life, I found myself murmuring, moving fast enough to put as much distance I could put with the fire, appreciating the weirdness of the life I found myself in after I had forcefully barged into the summoning ritual. Life was weird, I thought, my mind drifted to the ritual, the choice I made, and whether that cost the young man I had pulled away his life. I wouldn't blink before saving my own life even if I faced the same choice, of course, but that didn't mean I was happy with the consequences. On to more priority issues, I murmured as I shook my head when a creature attacked me. A small beast, barely bigger than a squirrel, and shaped roughly the same except for the huge teeth he was displaying. A slash of the ordinary knife was enough to decapitate it, making its regeneration capabilities useless. +3 experience. It wasn't exactly an impressive amount, but maybe it was wrong for me to expect it to be so. Curious about how much experience I needed, I sent a mental command, summoning the level screen. Class, Hero. Level, 10. Experience, 0/43, 500. Wow, that's a lot of experience, I murmured as I checked the number. I had expected it to increase, but not to this degree. It was almost 8 times the experience that was required to level up earlier. It made the measly 3-point that was represented by the rodent-like beast even more negligible, thousands required for just one level up, but I didn't spend much power on the economics of magical power, not when I had a much simpler problem I was facing. Which direction to go? I didn't have much in terms of clues. I wasn't able to see many signs of civilization during my descent, though I wasn't able to pay much attention, with other things taking priority. Like trying to stay alive. The best I could remember was the general direction the flying castle was moving forward, based on the alignment of the 2 mountains I could see at a distance. I could either try to follow that route, hoping that the castle's descent meant our destination, the capital, wasn't too far away. Going to the capital was not really tempting due to all the talk I heard between Taras and Philael about the value I represented, with the explicit referrals to the bidders. And, even worse, after what I had experienced during the promotion, I had a sinking suspicion that those bidders didn't refer to humans. I would have loved to stay away from the capital. Going to the exact opposite would be particularly tempting. Unfortunately, I didn't have the slightest idea about the world I was in. Maybe there wasn't even a city that I could reach. I don't have any option, do I? I murmured as I looked at the rodent that burst out of the bushes, trying to ambush me, only to meet with its end as I swung the dagger. +2 experience. Sometimes, bad choices were the only choices. Going to a place they wanted me to be was bad, but getting lost in a world that I had no idea how it worked was even worse. I started running. The fire was still going on at a distance, its unique glow enough to alight the night, still growing. I was only being attacked by small rodents, and I might have believed it was the limit of what the forest held, but I had seen the huge horde of flying beasts attacking the fortress. I had a sinking suspicion that the only reason I was getting away was that fire, stealing the attention of the bigger, more dangerous animals. With a shrug, I continued to run. Even if my assumption about the forest was wrong, as the occasional small beast was the limit of the danger it represented, there was no harm in moving faster. Especially since, running near full speed barely drained my stamina. Interestingly, the increased strength didn't allow me to run considerably faster than I was doing when I had been running away from the assassins. But it wasn't the only weird thing about the system and how stats worked, and experimenting was not exactly the biggest priority. Getting away was. I felt a movement to my right, and my dagger flashed. A bat-like creature fell on the ground, bisected. I didn't even blink at the threat. +4 experience. After the tentacle monsters, corrupting crimson energies, mad servants, and a matterman that was in the process of turning into a monster, a run through a monster-filled forest during the night was, almost comforting. +24 experience. Maybe not so comforting, I murmured myself, pausing for a moment to look for a stone I could use to sharpen the dagger, looking at the bisected beast on the ground only for a moment. It was the 5th time I stopped. I appreciated the opportunity to rest, as even with the boost given by the stats, running for several hours with naked feet was uncomfortable. Still, the discomfort never reached the point to actually slow me down. It was the dagger, losing its sharpness, that forced me to stop. During my run, I had to kill enough beasts to count in thousands. And that was not even an exaggeration, as I had a handy mental counter. Experience, 12,194. Though, only as the distance between me and the fire increased, the beasts started attacking and started to get stronger. Some were bigger, some were faster, but usually granted more experience. Still, other than several practice swings, I didn't use the magical sword I had acquired, and limited myself to the ordinary dagger. A part of the reason was familiarity. Unlike swords that I had never used before, I had used daggers extensively, sometimes to make sure a street fight didn't escalate to the point of using guns. Sometimes, to deliver a solitary silent strike in the middle of the night, handling problems in a more permanent manner. But, even more important than the familiarity was the durability of the magical weapon. I had no idea whether they had such a problem, but if they did, I didn't have the ability to repair it, and I would much prefer to leave the tests until I met with a threat I couldn't deal with ordinary steel. I grabbed the rough stone and dragged the dagger, doing my best to maintain a 20-degree angle as I dragged the dagger several times, creating a workable angle. Not perfect by any means, but useful when paired with the power I could put behind the blows. "Hope I will come across a sign of civilization soon," I murmured. I had been running for almost 6 hours, and I did it with a speed that would have made any long-distance runner jealous. I didn't have anything to measure, but it wasn't wild to assume it was over 10 miles an hour, 6 hours putting me just above 60 miles. A considerable distance not to see any sign of civilization. "It can't be too far away," I murmured, still continuing, glad that vitality allowed me to run without eating and drinking anything, an experiment that I wasn't willing to commit to until I had no other option. Then, I looked back, only to see the forest fire getting even bigger, the flames still carrying that deep crimson color that awakened a strange sense of disgust in me. "It'll probably go off soon," I murmured, not sure how much I believed in my own words. I broke into a run. Again. Boring was an interesting way to define a sprint through an otherworldly forest filled with overgrown wild beasts that were getting exceedingly hostile to human life, with some kind of corrupting fire still spreading behind me. But, as the night started to fall down, that was the best description of my mood. The run was hard to describe as comfortable, even with all the advantages given by the stats, but monotone was a good way to describe it. Even the constant attacks of the monsters, with the beasts getting more and more dangerous the farther I had moved from the fire that was still ongoing. Regardless of the healthiness of such a mood, it meant that I had some time to consider my position. First, my assets, a 5 denica piece of silver that managed to stay in my pocket despite all the chaos. The bigger piece unfortunately lost a magical sword that I barely used, and a steel dagger that was at the end of its life due to constant usage. I didn't know exactly how much those assets were truly worth, but it was better than not having anything in a completely foreign world. The other thing I thought about was my skill, one that was feeling dormant since the echo of it had forced me to accept the promotion process, one that gave some kind of demonic force to make a deal with me. Archery of destruction, 0\x. The other thing was leveling. With almost halfway to the next level, whether I should level up once I collected enough experience was a question. It was tempting, especially since I was in a position where I desperately needed every scrap of power, but one fact stopped me. Leveling up created some kind of magical noise, and that noise attracted the aggression of the monsters. Testing whether those monsters preferred to attack the forest fire or me leveling up was not a question I wanted to experiment with firsthand. Certainly not when my health was in such a depleted state. "Time to check my surroundings," again, I murmured as I looked around, looking for an elevated point, which I found in the form of a nearby hill. It wasn't particularly high, but as long as I climbed a tree, I should be able to get a better view of my surroundings. And, hopefully, discover a sign of civilization. The increased strength and agility once again proved extremely useful, allowing me to climb to the trees with a speed and grace that would make an acrobat die of jealousy, with only one hand, still gripping my dagger with the other. Not in vain. I slashed that dagger, and a snake fell on the floor, headless. Plus 193 experience. "That's a lot," I murmured. The snake was the first beast I had killed during the long run that actually granted experience in 3 digits, which wasn't a good sign about the danger I was in. Maybe it was venomous and it somehow impacted the gain, or maybe there were other factors. I just hoped it wasn't the attraction of the growing fire, getting less and less effective as the distance grew. I still didn't dare to push forward. I settled on the highest branch that could still carry my weight, and looked around. I only threw a glance behind me, confirming the fire was still continuing to grow and making me feel even more queasy as it grew. But, I didn't let that bother me too much. Because, on the other side, I could finally see the end of the forest at the horizon, maybe 10 miles, maybe even less, and even better, I could see a tower, the first man-made structure that wasn't flying. I stayed on top of the tree, watching for signs of activity, perception allowing me to get a functional glimpse of what was going on. I lived too long to assume that people would be honest and kind toward a lost stranger, especially if that stranger knew nothing about the world he was supposed to be living. As far as telling anyone my true origin, a derisive chuckle escaped my lips even at the thought of such an absurd thing. That was clearly not even a possibility. I stayed on top of the tree, watching from the distance, not daring to get closer. Since perception allowed me to get a better view of what was going on, it wasn't excessive to assume that the others, especially ones assigned to a tower that was in the middle of nowhere, clearly built for scouting purposes, wouldn't have a high perception. Even my current location was a bit risky, but I wasn't as attention-grabbing as the constantly growing forest fire. My patience paid off. An hour after I had taken my position, killing several smaller beasts that chose to attack me in the process, I noticed another movement in the distance. 4 floating metal boxes, similar to the one that the intruders used. The biggest difference was the size. The device I had momentarily used was a little bigger than a car, while these floating boxes were each bigger than a bus, and each arrived at the tower, a small bridge soon appearing. Several people, soldiers or knights, I reasoned, the glint of their silver armor visible even from that great distance. I wanted to get out of the forest, but without getting too close to the show. I had picked a diagonal angle, occasionally slashing my dagger to deal with another vermin that decided to bother me while I tried to find my path, moving much slower than my earlier dash, not wanting to get caught. Every 10 minutes, I climbed another tree to get a better view of my surroundings. Soon, I saw another tower, once again at the border of the forest, about 10 miles apart from the first tower I had picked. Around it, there were another 4 large flying vehicles parked. My guess, they were there for the forest fire. I started moving parallel to the forest, afraid of getting noticed without the concealment of the forest. 5 miles weren't far enough to guarantee avoiding ordinary sentries, let alone supernatural ones. I was wondering the reason for their lack of action when I noticed a presence pulling down from the clouds. A flying castle. For a moment, I froze, afraid that it was the same one that I had escaped, but that fear didn't last long. The biggest clue, the flying castle wasn't surrounded by a deadly crimson glow and had some kind of tentacle monster on top of it. Other than that, the castle had a similar pattern, fancy outer walls, 4 towers at each corner, and one, shorter, central tower in the middle. Though, one of the 4 corner towers was shattered halfway, and its flight was hardly steady. Interesting, I thought, especially after realizing it didn't come from the direction of the capital, but from a different direction. I started to have a feeling that the broken tower might have something to do with a wild tentacle. A feeling that only got stronger when another fortress appeared in the clouds, this time with one of the towers completely shattered, and 2 others damaged. No wonder the fortress didn't try to chase me after my escape. As those flying castles slowly floated down, I had a feeling that they were preparing to deal with the growing forest fire, a reasonable assumption considering the source of the fire, but they didn't seem to intend to move forth immediately. And, with the forest fire spreading behind me, I couldn't just stay in the forest and wait for them to approach. Especially since the fire was important enough to earn such an intense reaction. I needed to exit the forest in a way that wouldn't alert them. I started dashing parallel to the edge, hoping to find a way to do so. Another few miles later, I heard the sound of running water. Maybe, I whispered hopefully, and continued rushing. Soon, I caught a glint, the vision of a river cutting through the forest. It was a large, raging river that sent a chill through me, the water raging and aggressive. If it wasn't for the enhancement of my stats, I wouldn't have dared to even walk near that, let alone consider swimming. Even with the stats, it didn't sound like a perfect idea, especially since I had no idea what manner of creatures the river might hold. But still, it was much better than the alternative. "It's time to use you," I murmured as I turned my attention to my less used weapon, practicing a few swings, nothing complicated, considering I was going to be underwater. Then, I undressed, turned my clothes into a tight pack, and wrapped it to my back, not willing to lose my meager riches. I looked at the river, fast and dangerous, then behind me, where the forest fire was slowly growing to be more and more intense. "How fun," I murmured as I tightened my grip on my sword, closing the distance, taking the last few steps to bring me to the edge, feeling the wetness under my tortured soles. A few more steps, and I would be in the water. I held my breath and jumped, letting the chilly water cover me even as I pulled myself deeper, my eyes open, stretching my senses to the limit to get a sense of my surroundings. Just in time, I felt a shadow moving to my leg. I forced my eyes open even as I swung my sword, cutting down the approaching beast before I could even get a sense. I didn't want to take the risk of getting damaged, not when my reserves of health had already dwindled. Plus 33 experience. A small gain, but not useless. I swung my arm again, even as I calculated my capacity to hold my breath, my free arm enough to keep me down underwater. Several more fish rushed forward, immediately after the first one, forcing me to swing my arm again. The benefits of the stats were the only reason I could treat the river as a liquid highway rather than the mortal danger it was supposed to represent. The violent pull of the water was easily counteracted by one arm swimming thanks to my enhanced strength, and the aggressive rush of the carnivorous fish was easily detected by my perception. Still, I was glad for the enhancement I had received from that ability. Without it, I doubted the experience would have been as smooth. That didn't mean I could let my attention wander, of course. I could feel a fish that was about to take another bite around my ankle. I swung my leg in a timely manner, kicking it away faster than it could react, while I swung the sword to kill another. Plus 48 experience. The bigger challenge was to keep a track of my distance toward the towers, and make sure it didn't bring me to a dangerous point of access. I pushed out a minute later, realizing the raging waters of the river already carried me more than a mile. Good, I murmured as I sank back, my blade already dancing to destroy the fish that seemed determined to destroy me. Plus 15 experience. Plus 43 experience. Plus 10 experience. Luckily, there weren't any strong beast underwater that was attacking me, which I felt was more about the reaction those strong beasts had against the corrupting fire rather than lack of danger. Either way, I enjoyed the relative lack of danger as I did my best to stay underwater, holding my breath for a few minutes, not even straining my lungs despite the constant effort, once again highlighting the superior nature of vitality. I continued slashing at a serene pace, enjoying fishing in a very novel manner as I made sure to prevent any dangerous bite, but my real attention was making sure I didn't face any kind of sudden danger that would force me to push out. Not when I was so close to the sentry towers at the edge of the forest. A minute passed, then two, as I enjoyed the quickness of the stream. However, as I closed the location of the towers, at the 3 minutes mark, I slowed down. By actually grabbing the bottom of the river, afraid that the river bottom might have had some kind of trap. I didn't expect much, as I had already checked the river was not passing next to a tower, and I believed they would have built some kind of barrier if they were afraid of that fact. Still, having a confirmation was good. I once again let the river take me forward, leaving the towers and the flying castles behind. After 5 more minutes, I started looking for a convenient location I could use to get another glimpse of the outside without revealing myself too much. Plus 72 experience. Plus 110 experience. Plus 10 experience. Plus 42 experience. I continued to kill the river creatures as I moved, noting that the beasts were getting stronger the farther I got away from the forest, confirming my earlier guess that it was the fire that was distracting the other members. Soon, I noticed a nice curve on the side, one that would have allowed me to raise my head without being immediately visible by the sentry towers. I pushed my head out, carefully at first, ready to delve back the moment I noticed a nearby presence. That, I didn't notice. But I noticed a veritable army moving forward, each floating just under the clouds. 4 flying castles, each looking pristine, accompanied an even bigger flying fortress that was several times bigger, hexagonal, with 6 towers occupying the corners. Suggesting that whatever Taras had done might have been an even bigger problem than I assumed. I'm so glad it's not my problem, I murmured as I allowed the water to take me once more. Yet, as I swam and fought against the beasts, I was feeling the exhaustion building up. The river allowed me to travel much faster than was supposed to be possible, but that didn't mean it was easy. Battling against the furious speed of the stream was difficult enough even with my new enhancements, but that didn't even include the furious dance of my sword, almost in constant motion to keep me safe. And the added challenge of holding my breath. I wondered if Heath could be used for that purpose, and closed my eyes for a fleeting moment, where there was no fish around me. Time to replenish, I thought, and tried to channel health, the same way I did when I was injured. -2 health. Shockingly, it worked, spreading a warm sensation into my body, like a hug, taking most of my exhaustion away. The exhaustion wasn't completely gone, but I was still happy with the result. I felt far more renewed than I would have felt after a short nap. And, under the circumstances, it was a good deal, even if I had to sacrifice the same energy that could have been used against a mortal injury. A long journey awaited me. I let the river carry me along for a whole night, allowing me to stay outside the view of the occasional flying vehicles, which was my only option without any forest to block the view. Even after the sun rose once more, I stayed in the river. The light meant that it was much more likely for me to get caught, but I hoped that people had more important things to pay attention to. That wasn't all disadvantages, of course. Sunlight allowed me to observe my surroundings much more accurately. The lack of a forest or any kind of other concealment seemed to be intentional, as the area was wholly open, the only exception being a few settlements, small towns, and villages but surrounded by thick walls, this time, ordinary, stationary kind. Interestingly, none of those towns were right at the edge of the river. Some were close, but none were right next to it. However, they were empty, and more importantly, they were showing signs of being evacuated in a hurry, which included some chimneys that were still smoking, the discarded items all around to show just how big of an emergency they were facing. I stayed in the river. It wasn't a comfortable experience, and poking around one of those abandoned settlements, especially when they were built close to the river, was tempting. Yet, it wasn't only the risk of getting caught that kept me back. They were evacuating with great urgency, the kind that people usually reserved for earthquakes and floods. I didn't want to risk delaying, in case their reaction was not just an overreaction. And remembering the way that crimson energy spread all along the forest, I wasn't willing to bet on an overreaction. I didn't build my business on reckless bets. Still, I wondered exactly how long ago was the evacuation, and how much away was the first group. After a while, I received the answer. The first group of people, about a few hundred, created a small yet ordinary caravan, carts pulled by horse-like creatures, their speed little better than crawling. Though, I wasn't exactly ready to blame the beasts of burden for it, considering every cart was not only pulled by only one animal, but piled to the brim, the weight enough to kill an ordinary horse. Clearly, they had some kind of supernatural strength, but it was limited. They stayed on the road, which moved some distance away from the river, though that didn't surprise me much. Even with all the speed the river implied, its speed was far too fast to actually allow ordinary riverboats to survive. That was just the first, and not the only caravan I had seen. I had seen a few more soon after, some smaller, some bigger, but each piled to the brim, which didn't exactly fit the great hurry they had emptied the settlements. More importantly, the limited number of caravans didn't fit with the number of emptied settlements. Then, I had seen one of those groups, stopped at another emptied village, went through their stuff, and understood the reason for it. They prioritized profit over safety. I let those stay back, the water dragging me away from them, my sword not stopping even for a second as I dealt with an ever-rushing beast, exhaustion building despite all the improvements, forcing me to spend another point of heath, through the flood of experience was enough to compensate. -1 health. +24 experience. +54 experience. +11 experience. +40 experience. Even as I fought, I continued observing the surface as much as possible. I started to see other caravans, ones that were far bigger, counting in thousands. More importantly, their carts were not piled desperately, and each cart moved almost as fast as a horse would have done back on Earth if they were running freely. A great achievement indeed, giving me a better sense of their capabilities. More importantly, as I traveled, I saw two caravans meet and merge, which gave me hope that I could infiltrate them if necessary. The reason wasn't too hard to understand. While it wasn't as intense as my little river adventure, the caravans were dealing with the constant attack of the critters as well, meaning, the bigger, the safer. Especially once they got sufficiently far away from the cursed forest fire that the larger beasts once again started targeting the caravans. Still, I stayed in the water, limiting myself to my unusual manner of fishing, waiting for a better opportunity. Maybe until the darkness covered the land once again. I managed to stay in the river for the whole day, continuing with my unusual method of fishing, even as the beasts got stronger and stronger, though not as much to prevent me from handling them from a strike from my sword. +54 experience. +130 experience. +71 experience. +30 experience. At least, it was not all bad, I murmured as I pushed to the surface once more. More confident, now that the darkness had fallen once more, not afraid that I would be noticed by the occasional flying castle or fortress that was in the sky. The number of flying fortresses alone had reached a dozen, while the smaller castles had reached almost 3 digits, further highlighting the capabilities of the world I had found myself in. Hiding was turning out to be better and better. At least, until I felt a sudden sense of presence underneath me. One that recognized as the weight of the charisma, though it hit me differently than Taras' aura of trust later replaced with some kind of madness or Philael's pressure of obedience. It was more of a call to distraction, asking me to swim closer, just like the stories of the siren. I was glad for that, as without that presence, I wouldn't have noticed the stirring in the river bed until it was too late. I swam to the shore as fast as I could manage, though I barely moved a few feet away from the radiating point. Some kind of ambush predator, I realized even as I stretched my new capabilities to the limit to avoid its attack. If it wasn't for the early warning, I would have been taken down by the beast, which wasn't exactly good news. I wasn't able to catch its appearance, as the moment it burst out of the bottom, the mud and sand spread, turning the river into a turbid mess. Though, even with my impaired vision and challenges of dodging underwater, it hadn't been particularly difficult to avoid the attack once I had moved in the opposite direction the creature wanted. I moved toward the shore, though I swung the sword in front of me preemptively, in case it could correct its direction rapidly. Instead, I heard the sound of a huge body bursting out of the water and falling back in. I continued moving toward the shore, and my perception stretched to the limit. When it attacked me again, it once again came with a warning, the same pressure that I ignored easily thanks to resilience. It only helped me to predict its charge, nothing more. As I felt the water move, the sword was already moving and sank right into its huge open mouth. Unlike the previous times, the hit of the magical sword didn't result in a sudden burst of experience, just another wave of mental pressure, more primal and much stronger yet still ignored easily. The voice ordered me to fear, but I just gripped the sword harder, which gave me leverage to avoid its huge jaws. It charged, ignoring the injury, and I held the sword, ignoring the fear. Its linear charge worked to my benefit, and before it could slow down, I felt ground under my feet. I didn't know if the beast was intelligent enough to understand the tactical implications of that mistake, or if it was driven by instincts, but it started pulling back. But the way it suddenly twisted its head, the pull strong enough to drag me back if I didn't react by releasing my grip. As the beast retreated back into the water, the pressure once again easily ignored. The beast tried to attack me again, but I was already at the shallow edge of the river, and I threw myself to the side. I pulled out of the water, and I even dashed away, ignoring the cries of the beast and the pressure it radiated, and instead hurriedly pulled the dagger out of my little pack. Though, I couldn't help but feel a pang at losing the magical sword in the chaos. Soon, its cries had subsided, along with the thrashing in the water, even enough to avoid my perception. I might have even believed that, if it wasn't for the constant pressure, begging me to get close. Fascinating, I murmured as I started walking toward the hill first, glad that there was a nice little hill not too far away, blocking my view, swinging my dagger to take down a bird that decided to dive down to kill me. Plus 13 experience. I was tempted to run along the riverbank, dipping under water whenever there was a caravan close by, but the presence of the creature that could be still felt was enough to dissuade me from it. Whatever pulled the chaotic fire was radiating to distract the stronger monsters. It was sufficiently away that even the stronger creatures were out of its range of pull. It was time for the next stage of the plan. I did my best to squeeze my clothes dry, then put them on, though after ripping the silver symbol on the chest, another rip was sufficient trade to make the robes look even more ordinary. I even grabbed a handful of dust to spread along my clothes, giving an even messy appearance. Since the robe had many signs of damage, it was better for them to look immediately. Then, I climbed to the top of the hill, and took note of my surroundings. The first thing I noticed was the number of caravans below the hill. I could see dozens of caravans sprawled around the relatively flat landscape, even the smallest caravan with more than a few hundred tents and campfires. I swung my blade once more to deal with another little bird that decided attacking me was the best idea. Plus 3 experience. Interesting, I murmured as I continued my observation, trying to decide which caravan to try and infiltrate. In a stroke of luck, of all the camps I could see, the one that was closest to the river gave me the best opportunity to sneak in. However, it was not a coincidence, as I could see several caravans, positioned in layers. The outside ones looked more chaotic, compared to the groups that were on the inner side of the camps. I had a feeling that it was less of a coincidence, and more of an intentional structure. The camps at the outer layer were under a constant siege of creatures, most small, some large, almost constantly battling. Surprisingly, while they had some ranged capability, they were only using that against the larger beasts, and dealing with the smaller ones exclusively through close combat. Not that shocking. Facing that many creatures, saving ammunition were clearly a reasonable objective. The layout implied and their state confirmed that the outer camps were inferior to the inner ones. Conveniently, even among the outer camps, the worst camp was the one nearest to the river, though it was bigger than most camps. An interesting change from my world, in which being close to the river was a great advantage. Though, not surprising under the light of my own experience in the depths of the river. They had good reasons to be afraid of the water, especially when combined with the mental assault of the beast. Inner camps had a sense of discipline. Their tents were larger, mostly uniform, and set up perfectly, and they had armed patrol groups moving around, ready to defend, but there were almost no animals attacking them. Order was clearly a foreign concept in the outer camps, especially the one I was planning to target. The camp itself was dispersed, with several groups of tents sprawled around far too widely to be reasonable in a monster-filled world. Unless the members were more afraid of each other than the monsters. Among the 12 distinct camps I could see from the hill, the one closest to the river was by far the worst to be a part of. Which meant, it was the perfect location for me to poke around. Naturally, I didn't come directly down the hill and rushed to the camp. I double-backed for a mile, and then started to walk toward the camp. Trying to sneak into the camp was risky, but not as risky as going forward blindly with no information. If the worst happened, I could have just dashed back to the riverside, hoping that the magical orders of the monster would be enough to deal with the followers. As I started to get closer, I started to notice more accurate details. Like the fact that there were almost constant movements between two groups, but it wasn't an equal flow. I noticed that, after killing the beasts, they didn't leave them on the ground, but dragged them toward a large tent, some kind of large butcher station, where several people continuously worked on the beasts, separating various parts. And, after a sufficient amount of choice cuts were collected, a small group of couriers piled them into a cart and brought them to inner camps. Occasionally, some people from the camp arrived to pick some for themselves as well, but most of the beasts were thrown onto a huge bonfire, to be destroyed. It was against the principles of hunting to waste such a great amount of material, but considering it was the beasts that were constantly attacking the group, I was willing to cut them some slack. As the monsters, I decided that it was a good moment to check the current state of my abilities. I closed my eyes, and called the system. Class, Hero. Level, 10. Experience, 0/43, 500. Health, 3/225. Experience, 98.436. Stats. Resilience, 30. Vitality, 15. Strength, 18. Agility, 17. Perception, 15. Memory, 3. Charisma 1. Locked. Stat points, 1. Skills, Archery of Destruction, 0/X. Abilities, Elevated Life, Basic, Human. Alignment, Unaligned. As I walked closer to the camp, I received a better view of the workings of the operation. Some details, like the mismatched pieces of armor and damaged weapons, I already expected to see. Some, like the constant verbal battles between different patrol groups, even more intense than I expected, was a surprise. However, most of my attention was firmly fixed on the way they were fighting. It was unnatural. Even among the patrol teams, there was absolutely no coordination, each battling against a creature, even to the point of occasionally injuring each other. Yet, that wasn't as interesting as the way they swing their weapons. Every single warrior I could see was, for lack of a better term, stiff. Some limited themselves to wide, sweeping slashes, while others limited themselves to stabbing movements. For some, it was reasonable, as a spear was rather limited in terms of attack options, but even the ones that were using others' weapons, like halberds and great swords, were limited in their attacks. And, every single one of them had the same curious habit I had observed back when I had fought against the servants. Every single hit was delivered fully, with no holding back, only to go back to their starting position. Even at the cost of taking easily avoidable damage. Yes, their wounds recovered quickly, but that shouldn't be a reason to take such wounds. Such an interesting way of making battle. Since everyone was fighting like that, I chose to limit myself to slashes, delivering full, wide strikes whenever a beast had drifted too close, though I made exceptions whenever I would take damage. My health was depleted enough. That was hard to notice when the distance between me and the camp was measured in miles, but the shorter the distance became, the more likely for someone to notice the irregularity. Luckily, the shorter the distance got, the easier for someone to notice that some of my attacks had been cut short. Luckily, that wasn't the only change. The closer I got to the camp, the less the beasts targeted me, attracted by the larger group instead. What an interesting world, I murmured as I continued observing the people, this time focusing on their physical attributes. On that, their feature of delivering full strikes was useful, giving me a rather accurate sense of their strength and agility. It wasn't a trivial thing to achieve, especially at a distance, but my perception, combined with a lifetime habit of measuring others, another valuable talent in my old line of work, I was able to get a reasonable sense. And, my measurement was enough to confirm that only a few had stats that surpassed me, whether in agility or in strength, and it wasn't hard to see those were lacking in other stats. The strong ones were clumsy, unable to recover fully from their own swings, while agile ones lacked the strength to deliver one-hit kills. Only ones I couldn't exactly rival were the fast ones, dashing around with alacrity I couldn't rival. Interestingly, some of them lacking both agility and strength. From my training, I guessed speed was the reason for their state. Agility is harder to hide than strength, I decided as I closed in, adjusting my combat capabilities accordingly. I didn't want to hide my strength forever as well, but until I could get a better sense, it was better to be conservative. As I killed the occasional beast that attacked me, I started holding back, even when it meant that, against some of the larger beasts I had to hit several times. No one told anything to me, or even looked my way for more than a few seconds, which encouraged me about my strategy. I knew most wouldn't even call marching across an open field, in plain sight, a strategy. But for me, it was the best way to accomplish my goal. After all, only someone without any bad intentions would just walk into a camp filled with thousands and thousands of people, every single one of them armed. I walked forward about half the distance. I was certainly close enough to get their attention. About 50 yards away from me, I could see a group of 20 dragging one of the larger breasts, larger than an elephant, but they didn't even pay attention to me. What a shame. For a moment, I hoped that it was going to be the extent of what I was dealing with. Then I noticed a lone warrior walking toward me, his gaze leaving no doubt that I was his target. He was wearing silver armor, the design of it similar to the ones the soldiers back in the flying castle had been wearing, though simpler and cheaper, and carried no mark, which distinguished him from the crowd that was walking around him. Though I didn't need to recognize his armor for that, the way the others parted around him was enough to clue. I suppressed the temptation to start running like a new gang member might do, and instead looked at him. "Hey, you, follow me," he ordered immediately, before he started walking back, his tone brokering no argument, expecting to be obeyed. Following him was a good idea, especially since he was confident or reckless enough to turn his back. I had dealt with many kinds of enforcers, both lawful and lawless, and one thing was common. Not one of them was stupid enough to walk recklessly if they weren't absolutely confident in their security. It wasn't the time to test that. I walked, fast enough to close the distance, doing my best to copy the slightly worried look of a civilian accosted by a sudden military checkpoint. Just because his back was turned didn't mean that others weren't observing my position. The armored warrior brought me toward the mobile butcher station where everyone had been carrying the carcasses of the beasts. Or more accurately, 300 yards behind it, toward a smaller, but much fancier tent. An interesting position for a high-ranking commander to take, I decided. The thick smell of blood and smoke from the bonfire was hardly the most comfortable location. Maybe he was there to make sure there was no thievery. Or maybe not. I corrected myself as I turned my gaze to the skies, and looked at the sky, taking note of the density of the flying beasts. They were densest right on top of the tent, attracted by the butchering operation. Though, despite the constant killing, I was yet to see anyone leveling up in my immediate surroundings. Interesting. I wondered if I could use that detail to my benefit if things had turned too dangerous. Maybe I could trigger the level up and disappear from the confusion. Not to retreat, but to slip into the camp, already trying to find the best path inside the camp. That was just a last resort, of course. I had no intention to risk myself unless things reached a dangerous point. I continued following the group until we stood in front of the tent, where 4 armored figures were waiting for us. 3 more warriors, wearing identical silver armor. And a teenager, barely 15 in my guess, wearing an armor that was fancier than Captain had been wearing back in the flying castle. It was the teenager that spoke. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to sound serious, though with his age, that only came across as petulant. Not that it mattered much, when that feeling was accompanied by the pressure of charisma, ordering me to obey. With my current resilience, ignoring that was trivial. I only paused a moment to take note of the intensity and the shape, to fake a perfect answer. The first rule of lying, always acts how they expected. It was a lesson I had used many times during my career, especially the times I was still working as a freelance problem handler, the permanent kind. A statement to the police about an assassination I saw was much more effective while faking a panic attack. The pressure he radiated was more similar to Falail's direct orders rather than Taras' weird aura of likable obedience before his weird transformation, but the intensity was significantly lower than Falail's iron orders. Interestingly, the pressure was still stronger than the nameless captain could generate. So, rather than the frustrated yet helpless expression of the soldiers, I wore the slack-jawed expression of the servants whenever they were ordered by Philael. "My name is Yuan, my lord, a retired resident," I said, putting a dazed cadence in my tone as I used the name of the unlucky servant that I had robbed back then. Since neither the warriors nor the young man looked alarmed, it seemed that my ploy was sufficiently convincing. "And why are you here, alone?" he asked, the pressure lessening as he asked. My group had decided to ignore the orders and decide to raid the abandoned settlements until the carts are full of greedy traders, I explained. So I left the group to join the bigger caravans. It seemed like the best explanation, as whatever the danger was, it was clearly important enough to trigger widespread evacuation, and the morons that decided to prioritize furniture over safety made a convenient excuse. "They are ignoring their orders, traitors," he gasped in shock. The intensity could only be generated by a sheltered youth with little experience. Warriors around him just grunted, but none of them bothered to say anything. "We should go and teach them a lesson. How dare they ignore their orders?" Just like my questions, that order came with the weight of charisma. The warriors reacted immediately, each standing straight, their weapons drawn, like they were about to charge forward. "If you wish, my lord," one of them through squeezed teeth after several seconds, pushing himself to the limit to say his words. "But what about our order to defend the camp against stronger beasts?" he managed to say. I didn't say anything, just waiting obediently in front of him, looking at the ground. The pressure was not targeting me. Yet, the warrior showed me that it was possible to ignore orders backed by charisma, at least indirectly. "You're right," the teenager murmured, and the pressure disappeared. "My father won't like it if I don't complete my mission perfectly," he said as he turned and disappeared into the tent. I continued to look at the ground, faking a tremble. "What's your class and level?" the soldier asked. "Farmer, and level 28, sir," I answered, just as quick, but without the hypnotized tone I used earlier. It was a dangerous lie, especially about a class I didn't have, but unless I wanted to admit I was a hero, my option was to spout one of the classes I heard from the soldiers back when I was gambling. And since they despised farmers as particularly pathetic, I expected that to bring the least questioning. "At this age," murmured one from behind. "Pathetic. Any useful skills?" he asked. I said nothing, as I didn't know the names of the skills, and didn't want to risk spewing. Instead, I took that as an invitation to display, and pulled my dagger, showing a few slashes, all repeating the same pattern of fully completed hits. "Just a slash, somewhere in the intermediate area," the soldier growled dismissively. I nodded. "Useless, go into the camp and try to find something to do," they said, the mention of my class enough for them to fully dismiss me. Enough to ignore the fact that I had somehow walked from one camp to another without dying. Interesting bias. I sighed as I strolled into the camp, taking note of the chaos that was going on. I expected a level of discord, but the camp was even more disorganized than I had expected, with at least 5 shouting matches going on around me. The general structure of the camp was simple. Each close-knit group had established their tents close enough to touch each other, at least 4 people standing guard, ready against any attack. The camp was crowded enough that no land beast reached that point, and the flying ones were almost exclusively attracted to the butcher station and the huge bonfire. I didn't know whether the intention was to defend the camp or just a welcome side effect, but either way, I wondered it was a perfect solution if the tense attitude the people were showing as they walked around, some alone, some in groups. But all alert. However, even in that tense chaos, there were small islands of calm. A large pot of boiling food, guarded by 8 people, with a line in front, people exchanging small pieces of silver for stew. Some kind of portable forge, with 2 blacksmiths desperately working to fix shattered weapons, while an apprentice assuming his young age desperately sharpening swords. Further in the camps, there were other small islands of calm, but I stayed away from them for now. I lacked necessary information, and I couldn't handle any attention without pushing too much. As I walked around to the edges, not many paid attention to me, which, certainly, was not a coincidence. It was about my posture, just non-threatening enough to avoid notice, but whenever I noticed someone eyeing me to see if I was a weak target that they might shake, I met their gaze, neither fearful nor angry, suggesting that it was better for better prey. It was a skill and the ordinary kind, not the magical, coming from a stone kind I developed in my youth. Know where you are, know who's around you, and always catch any observer and have a strategy to challenge or avoid as necessary. Though, I had to admit perception was amazingly useful as I walked around the camp idly, taking note of everything that was going on before my targets could catch it. I observed not only people, but my surroundings. My first focus was trying to understand how the economy worked, and it was complicated. A lot of transactions were going on around the camp, both between the members of the same subgroups, and among the groups, but with little rhyme and pattern. The first thing I noticed, only a fraction of the trades actually used silver denikas, and mostly relied on barter instead, using various types of metals, minerals, crystals, and monster parts, as well as services and finished products. Add an intense bargaining that would have put an Egyptian bazaar to shame to the mix, and the values of goods and services turned into a horrible puzzle, probably further unsettled by the sudden order of evacuation and changing priorities. Very rarely, I had seen people using pieces of silver in trade, though those pieces were mostly in fractions of a denica. Showing 5 denica piece I had in my pocket was not an inconsiderable amount of wealth, making me glad that I had put some effort to maintain possession of it even during my desperate run. Pity I couldn't just spend it. The problem was the nature of the piece. Other people were using silver as currency, but not only denominations were different, but also none of the silver they used had the smooth shape of the piece I had in my pocket. Trying to use would only bring suspicion to me, meaning, effectively, the dagger was the only asset I could use for exchange. I had done nothing but walk around for an hour, observing the people and the camp, making me understand not only how the economy worked, but also how people interacted with each other. I was just another face in the crowd, too shabby to be paid attention to. An hour was not a short amount of time, but it was worth the effort I had put in. The first aspect was the prices. Some things, such as weapons, armor, and the material that could be used for construction, were extremely expensive compared to the other things, but the numerous grumblings I eavesdropped on suggested it was more about the exodus. A weapon repair almost cost a tenth of a denica, and even the poorest weapons sold for half a denica, though usually paid through barter rather than directly. The more expensive weapons went a denica or two, and armors were for a similar price. Of course, when I said decent, it was just in the range of what was on display. Most people had significantly better weapons than what was actually on sale, and with the exception of the 4 warriors and the young lord, none of the weapons were even close to the quality of the spears I had used against the beasts. I had no doubt that one of those spears could be sold here for at least 20 denicas, maybe even more. That was assuming I didn't just get killed, of course. Food was a more complicated issue. It was split into grades, based on the health they provided upon consumption and the taste, and while I didn't expect the taste to matter too much, the discussion implied that the food had contained some kind of harmful energy that then needed time to dissipate, and the taste was a good indicator of how much energy it contained. Though, from what I could see, they didn't sell the simplest kind of food that people handled for their own. I didn't feel anything harmful during the feast at the castle, but once again, it was probably about the quality of the food the nobles could access. Since I didn't plan to rob the tent of the young lord, I would soon experience that. As for the medicines and other materials, it was chaos, both in terms of pricing and in terms of arguments about the effectiveness, one that I stayed away from. Even with the assistance of perception, magical medicines sold by crooks were simply too complicated to be touched. Unfortunately, while my walk taught me a lot about how the basic economies worked, the same didn't apply to the system. Unlike my little gambling session with the soldiers, I wasn't there, leading the conversation to the topics I care about. The system was not one of the default talking topics. Or more accurately, its working principles were not something people talked about. People might talk about when the bus would arrive, but they didn't talk about to the workings of the internal combustion engine. Then, a notification popped into my sight. -1 health. As the warmth spread into my body, I felt like I had just had a good meal and a nice sleep, renewing my exhaustion. An excellent alternative to collapsing in deadly exhaustion. Pity that it dwindled my health reserves even further. I was aware of how much health remained. I was counting the dwindling number with the same obsessiveness I counted bullets in combat, but I still summoned the system to see, for the first time since the promotion. Health, 2/225. Looks like an emergency, I muttered. Useful, but only if I replenish my energy. It was time to buy some food. And to do that, I needed some silver that didn't shout suspicion. Luckily, while it had been a long while since I pickpocketed anyone, during the little encounter with Taras, agility proved that stiff fingers were no longer a problem. I walked forward, looking for a convenient target, and it didn't take long to find it. Two groups, one wearing black armbands, the other red. Gangs, and recently formed ones, a detail that I picked from their postures and the discussion that surrounded them. The two groups stood apart, but their members also put some distance between each other, occasionally checking their own members hesitantly. The lack of trust implied that they didn't go through many dangerous events together. Naturally, I wasn't actually targeting the gang members, even with the pouches on their belts that looked considerably larger than ordinary citizens. Not with my health already scraping the bottom. No, their presence created a commotion as they insulted each other, and everyone looked at them in fear, ready to dash away if they burst into combat. More importantly, they weren't paying attention to their immediate surroundings. I passed near a middle-aged man, who seemed to be nominally richer than the others, carrying a large box of materials. When I walked away, he was about a denica worth of silver poorer. I didn't skip even a step as I walked away, even when he noticed the thievery and started to raise a commotion. No one tried to stop me. Old, exhausted men were not the first target of suspicion. Still, I went to the other side of the camp to buy some food, from one of the less popular cooks. A large bowl, I said as I pointed at the stew. Money first, old boy, he said. I passed a misshapen piece of silver that was about 1/4 of a denica, almost 1.5 grams, and he passed me a stew. What a disgusting thing, I found myself murmuring after I took the first bite, a disgusting, acrid taste filling my mouth, though not as bad as my only aborted attempt to eat one of the beasts I killed, fearing poison. Did you just complain about my great cooking, old man? The cook answered, blistering at the mention. Feel free to try the tastier variants if you just want to gamble to see if you'll receive a point for a full meal. Don't worry about that, young man, it's just a bit bitter for my old tongue, I said placatingly as I stood at the side, quickly spooning down the stew despite its disgusting taste. Before I could even finish it, I received the first point. +1 health. However, that was not all good, as along with that warm energy of Heath, I felt another energy, colder, more hostile, spread into my body, and settle like a chill. It was probably the harmful energy they were talking about. Wow, you must be really hungry, the cook said. I know my cooking is strong, and you're the only one that can eat with such gusto. What kind of stone you crawled out of? Let's just say it was a bad patrol. Our idiot leader thought that he could handle one of the bigger beasts in melee, and predictably, it didn't go well, I said. Oh, really, he said. Was that bad? Not the worst, not the best, I said noncommittally as I finished the stew, barely in a minute, though surprisingly, I had received another point. +1 health. Surprising, because I didn't expect to gain another point this quickly. I had renewed health much faster in the castle, but the quality was leagues above what I was consuming. From what I had gathered, it was supposed to take hours to properly digest, not minutes. Pity I couldn't just come out and ask, as it was either about my soul ability, or my class. Not the topics I could casually poke without revealing my utter lack of knowledge about the world. Good food, I'll definitely visit later, I said. My name is Yuan, by the way. Zolist, the greatest cook in this godforsaken camp, the middle-aged man answered, and I walked away. With my health slowly regenerating, giving me a layer of protection, I felt like I could poke a bit more.